friend of the Whitaker family and wants to help them, but he doesn't want them to feel indebted to him in any way. If you take the case, you will bill him through my office. He is very capable of covering any costs involved and very happy to do so. He is hopeful you might be able to help the little girl. I know this is rather unusual, but the gentleman wants the best for the child and the family. Yes, it is rather unusual, Dr. Ikonde agreed, but I appreciate your client's benevolence. I will talk with the medical director and have my office get back to you. Later that day, Dr. Ikonde accepted the case, agreed to request and review Lamesha's records immediately, and promised to meet with her family as soon as possible. The next morning, between surgeries, he met his new patient in room 626. Mr. Ponder met with Theo to inform him of the arrangement. Theo, Lamesha is in good hands. The doctor is a remarkable man who specializes in treatment of leg injuries. He reviewed her records and said her condition is serious, but is cautiously optimistic of a good outcome. I got the impression he was not terribly pleased with the level of care she has received so far. He said she'll probably always have a limp, but there's no threat of losing a leg. Theo nodded. He was pleased that Lamesha's future care would be consistent and high quality. He was not sure how he might thank the doctor. And these will be all kept confidential. That's correct. The Whitakers only know that a new doctor is going to be taking care of her. I told Dr. Conley that a concerned friend had gotten involved. He understands the need for discretion. From what I can tell, he is a generous man himself. I hope the two of you can meet sometime. Rest assured, Lamesha is in the best of hands with him. That's very good. Thank you, James. By then the two men were on a first-name basis. And what have we worked out for the grandmother? Right. I got in touch with her employer. We're still working out the details, but basically they're going to give her paid leave until Lamesha's back home and situated. We'll deposit some funds with her employer, and they'll use that to pay her for as long as she's on leave. The folks who own the company are old friends of mine, and I told them I was working on behalf of a client who wishes to remain anonymous, so they'll keep it all secret. They spoke very highly of Mrs. Whitaker. Excellent, thank you. Theo grinned and patted Ponder's forearm. I hope you enjoy this as much as I do. We might just become a formidable force for good at this rate, yes? On earth as it is in heaven. Actually, Theo, I find this all rather curious, but it's certainly admirable. People like you renew my hope and humanity. Yes, we can be such a terrible race at times, but at the same time, terribly wonderful, all capable of saintliness. You too, James, you too. Chapter 20. It was inevitable, given their proximity to one another, that Asher Glisson and Theo would eventually cross paths. It happened at the Chalice one mid-morning. The old man was standing with his back to the entrance when Asher entered and walked past him. As Asher placed his drink order at the counter, Shep nodded in Theo's direction. There's the guy, your patron, the one who's been buying you pictures. Asher turned to the gratifying sight of Theo perusing one of the portraits. The old man was oblivious to everything else around him. Such intensity of observation was the highest praise anyone could possibly pay to the artist. Asher felt honored. But he was also curious as to the old man's intent. Minette, the day after her meeting with Theo, had given Asher a glowing report about their encounter at the Fetter, but she knew very few details about the man. All Asher knew was that a man from Portugal, a pleasant newcomer to town, had purchased a number of the portraits and had expressed an interest in all the ones still on the walls. "Excuse me, sir. Good morning. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I believe I owe you a thank you. I'm Asher Glisson." Theo had been studying the portrait of a little girl wearing a baseball cap. It took him a moment to reorient himself and break away from whatever thoughts filled his head at the moment. When he realized who was standing in front of him, he turned to face the younger man full on, smiled and nodded nervously, and fumbled to string a sentence together. "Oh, well, yes, of course. Oh, nice. Good morning. My, I'm so honored to meet you, Mr. Glisson. This is no interruption at all. I am a great admirer of your work. This is very nice indeed. Thank you for speaking. My name is Theo." Asher accepted the offered handshake with the politeness and respect due an elder. True to his habit, Theo held Asher's right hand in both of his own. He was nothing less than spellbound. Starstruck to be in the presence of the portrait master, his eyes shone brightly. Asher, true to his habit, closely examined the features of Theo's face. "It'll be a good face to draw," he thought. "He has strong eyes. Shep tells me you've bought several of the portraits, and I just want to tell you how much I appreciate your encouragement. That means a lot to me." He nodded to the portrait Theo had been studying. "Her name is Lila. She's a delightful little girl. She'd just come from the ballet practice when I took a picture." Theo nodded. "You have captured her beautifully, as you have all the others. Even her eyes are full of dance. And yes, Mr. Glisson, I have acquired several of the portraits so far, but only to give them good homes. I'm very pleased that I have discovered them. Young man, you are a master at what you do. Have you time to sit and visit?" Asher received the compliments with poise. This was not his first time hearing high praise of his work. "But thank you, Mr. Theo. Is that right, Theo? Only Theo, please, no Mr. "Well, Theo, I'd love to visit, but I have a meeting in just a few minutes. Could you come by my studio sometime? It's not far from here, and I'll be there all day tomorrow. Will that work for you?" "It would, yes, but I don't want to take you from your work." "Well, I appreciate that, but my schedule's flexible. Why don't you come in the morning, and we can visit over coffee? Is 9 o'clock too early for you?" "Just not good and loud when you come. I usually lock the door when I'm working." Asher gave Theo directions to his studio and a phone number, exchanged a few more well wishes, and then turned to leave. Theo watched Asher walk out, watched him speak to a young couple on the sidewalk, watched him place his coffee cup and a cup holder between the handlebars of his bicycle, and watched him ride away. Theo took a deep breath, removed his glasses, took another deep breath, and then left the shop. The plan was working just as he had hoped. Chapter 21. When Theo had taken his first walk down the sidewalks of the Bowery, the day after his arrival in Golden, he felt as if he had stumbled upon a place that was vintage Americana. That feeling grew with each stroll through the neighborhood. He learned that many of the extant old houses were built in the mid to late 1800s, when Broadway and downtown were the center of life in the community. The exteriors of those houses, gables, columns, porticos, handrails, dormers, ceilings, doors, window frames, pointed to a bygone architectural era that celebrated whimsy and individuality in residential design. Porches were standard fare. Some wrapped around the entire circumference of the houses to which they were attached. Others were nooks, often beside a front door. All allowed for and seemed to encourage the blessed leisure art of sitting and relaxed conversation. Lawns and gardens in the Bowery were well-groomed and meticulously cared for. On spring and summer days, the scent of gardenia, tea olive, camellia, and narcissus beckoned walkers closer and closer to the yards, where those fragrant plants grew in abundance. In the early generations of Golden's history, Houses in the Bowery had belonged to wealthy leaders in the community. More recently, during Golden's rejuvenation, many of the houses had been purchased by an eclectic assortment of artists, young families, professionals, and affluent history buffs who were willing to live at the borderlands of an increasingly gentrified town center to the north and a chronically impoverished low-rent district to the south. An abiding hope that the downtown would continue to flourish and, at the same time, retain a healthy regard for the city's past was a common trait among the tribe of Bowery residents. They were proud and protective of their little province, Asher among them. At 8:58 a.m., Theo arrived at 107 South Broadway, on the west side of the median. It was a 3-story house, pewter gray with green trim, red front door, and wraparound porch on 3 sides. Though obviously intended to be a residence at its inception, Asher and Brooke had bought it cheap and converted it into a studio. Asher did most of his work there, awash in natural light and able, through an assortment of strategically placed windows, to see trees and sky at all times with a mere tilt or turn of his head. Theo climbed 5 steps up to the porch and knocked on the door. He was a mixture of mild uneasiness and eagerness at the prospect of conversation with the young prodigy. As he waited for Asher to answer, he surveyed the porch. It was deep and long on the front side, with a balustrade of turned hourglass spindles. The porch ceiling was painted powder blue. An old superstition held that such a practice was effective at keeping bad spirits from entering a house and also at keeping spiders from spinning webs in the corners. Perhaps it worked. No bad spirits seemed to be present as Theo waited for Asher's welcome, nor did he see any spiders. Bronze wind chimes, still and silent at the moment, hung at one end of the porch. An assortment of wicker furnishings, neatly organized and cared for, filled the area without crowding it. Theo was making mental notes of flowers and plants around the lawn when he heard footsteps inside the house. Asher opened the door and wiped blue paint from his right hand with a towel before holding it out to Theo. "Good morning, Theo. Sorry to make you wait. I was just finishing a canvas and cleaning my brushes." Theo hesitated to step inside. "Please, Mr. Asher, let me come back at a more convenient time. I can come whenever you like. I don't want to take you from your work." "No, really," Asher insisted. "This is a perfect time. I woke up early and came on over to touch up something I was working on last night. I just finished so we can celebrate over coffee. Please, this is a good time. Come in." Finally convinced, Theo entered as Asher held the door for him. The smell of coffee and the strains of music, something baroque, greeted them. Theo, in true European fashion, presented a bouquet of flowers to Asher. "Oh, thank you, Theo. Echinacea and narcissus. My mother's favorites. How'd you know?" Asher pointed to the wall behind Theo. "Here's a painting I did years ago for her. Echinacea and narcissus. I'm guessing you saw it on my website, or Shep tipped you off. But thank you. Anything that makes me think of my mom is welcome here." Theo had barely glanced at the painting when Asher directed him to the back of the house. The walls along the hallway were filled with Asher's work. Theo was tempted to stop and linger with each step, but he resisted, settling instead for mere glances left and right as he walked to the large room that served as Asher's work area. Throughout that large, open room, hanging on the walls, displayed on the floor, stacked on tables, framed, unframed, matted, large, small, painted, drawn, finished, unfinished landscapes, cityscapes, birds, flowers, nudes, still lifes, portraits, and more portraits. The genius and exuberant output of Asher Glisson was on stunning display. For Theo, 107 South Broadway was sensory overload. If the entrance hall was an appetizer, this room was the main course of a feast. 3 easels, facing south, west, and north walls, held canvases of drawings in various stages of completion. On one was an unfinished oil portrait, slightly less than life-sized, a distinguished older man. He was standing in what appeared to be a home library. The tones were dark and subdued. The middle easel held a somewhat smaller work in progress, a pencil drawing of a child on snow-white paper. She was kneeling on a sidewalk beside a bucket of chalk, drawing a large smiley face that was asymmetrical and disproportionate. In Asher's composition, there was no background at all to the little girl. The viewer was forced to see her, and only her. The intricacy of the lines that composed the child, the soft shading of her face, the smallness of her body against the bare background, and the delicacy with which those elements had been laid on the paper created a sense that she had been whispered into existence. The drawing, as Asher explained later, was an illustration, one of 46, that he had done for a children's book. The third easel was a riverscape after nightfall. In contrast to the realism of the other two, this one, on a wide, narrow gesso board, was an impressionistic work in oil in which dense layers of color had been applied with a palette knife. The river in the painting was stippled in various shades of blue, black, white, and peach. The tree line, in deep greens, stood against a night sky that was purple at the horizon and darkened into blackness as it ascended. The piece was unlike Asher's other work, and yet, to Theo's eye, it bore the same delicacy of touch that was a defining quality of the artist's style. Theo took a cursory glance around the room, resisting again his desire to observe and study each piece closely. The sheer richness of the place washed over him, soft morning light, the scent of paint, the finery of oriental rugs, the aura of mastery, the history of the space, and the younger man's inviting presence enlivened the older. Theo would have gladly foregone conversation, at least for a while, to meander from frame to frame, stack to stack, wall to wall, easel to easel. But when Asher offered coffee and nodded to a pair of cushioned chairs with a small table between them, Theo politely took a seat. "Asher, thank you for letting me come by. I see now that you do more than portraits." Asher shrugged. "I try. Portraits have definitely been my bread and butter over the years, and I'm always honored when somebody asks me to do one for them. I love the challenge of drawing faces. Plus, I have a wife and daughter and a mortgage and all that, and portraits pay the bills. But I like to always have something I'm working on for the sheer pleasure of being creative. That one," Asher pointed to the river scene on the easel, "is my present diversion. Ones like that usually don't sell, or they pay me in other ways. They help keep me in love with what I do. But enough about me. What's your story, Theo? I detect an accent. Where's home?" Asher already knew, from speaking with his niece, Minette, that Theo was from Portugal, but he asked anyway. "I have lived in many places," Theo said, "but I was born and grew up in Portugal, a little town near Porto in the north, a place called Pinhao, in the Douro River Valley, with the hills and vineyards. It was a wonderful place to be a child. My parents were simple people, farmers, but they loved beauty, and they loved books, though we didn't have many. They died many years ago. I've been a businessman and investor for much of my life, so I've lived in big cities for the most part. Paris, Florence, Rio. I have a home in New York City now. I've been there almost 20 years. And what brings you to Golden? I have some properties nearby that need my attention." Asher remained silent momentarily in the hope that Theo might say more. Theo didn't, using the pause instead to sip his coffee. "How long will we be here?" Asher asked. "I'm not sure. But Mr. Ponder, you know him, yes, has been kind enough to let me rent his apartment at Ponder House. It's a lovely place." Asher seemed surprised. "I didn't know Mr. Ponder rented that apartment, but I'm happy to hear it. You'll have a front row seat to the promenade from up there." Theo nodded. "I am very fortunate. It's a beautiful place. You'll have to come see me sometime." "Theo, I hope the locals have been kind to you so far." "I've been in Golden pretty much all my life. Not a very ambitious artist, I guess. And I can't really compare it to anywhere else, but I know we've got some fine, generous people in our town. Got plenty of problems and bad elements too, but there seems to be a prevailing goodness here most of the time. Theo nodded again. I confess, I came here with some preconceived ideas about the South. Some good, some not so good. But the only ones I've confirmed so far have been the good ones. Golden strikes me as a nice place. The town is fortunate you stayed here all these years. So, Asher, please tell me about yourself. I feel that I know a bit about you from seeing your art. But what is your story? Well, it's pretty simple, really. I grew up here in Golden. My parents did too. They were old blood in the community, so my roots are deep here. My mom was a homemaker mostly, but she was an artist too. She studied art in college. Actually took some classes in Madrid at the Prado. A lot of things were changing in our country at the time. You know, political stuff in the 60s, Vietnam and such. But I never got the sense she was very interested in all that. She was real tender-hearted and had a wonderful eye for beauty. She tried to pass that down to my brother and me. I don't think there was a day when I was growing up that there weren't vases full of flowers in our house. She was quiet, sort of melancholy in a way, but always pleasant. My dad owned an ad agency. He wasn't an artist himself, but he appreciated talent. I was their first child. I was born just a few months after they married. It was something of a scandal in our little town, but they survived it. I have one brother named Pierce. I'm not very close to him. I was drawn to the smell of paint and linseed oil. He was drawn to the smell of money. Not a bad guy, but he thinks that all of this, Asher's hand swept the room, is a very questionable use of time. He's a tough one. I understand you met his daughter, Minette. Theo smiled brightly and nodded. I call her the world's greatest niece, Asher continued. She's had some tough knocks, but Brooke and I are crazy about her. She and my mom adored each other, Minnie and Gammy. Asher was not used to talking so freely about matters so personal. He would remark later that the old man listened in a way that made one dangerously willing to talk. A business partner had once described it as Theo's superpower. It was fully functional as Asher continued his story. Anyway, I went to a small college to study art, and when I finished, I came back here, thinking I would only stay a while and then move to a big city and try to establish a reputation in a bigger market. I think a lot of artists have that dream. Theo nodded. I ended up falling in love with a girl I'd known since grade school, Brooke. We got married, and we have one child, a daughter named Samantha. We call her Sam. She's a school teacher in South Carolina. And your parents? Well, my dad died not too long ago. He was sort of a soft-spoken, melancholy soul himself. But he was a good man and a good dad. He lived with me and Brooke at the end of his life. My mom died a few years ago of Alzheimer's. I was fortunate I was always able to spend a lot of time with her, especially toward the end of her life. Her mind was really gone, and she said some bizarre things. But she never got mean like some people do when they get the disease. It was hard on all of us to watch it trickle away, and it pretty much broke us financially. But I'm glad I was here. Up to the very end, she seemed to enjoy painting. Theo nodded. He had listened without a twitch. Your mother must have been very pleased you became an artist. You are a fine student. Asher smiled. I hope so. I think maybe you don't realize how gifted you are, Theo said. He leaned slightly forward, as if to emphasize his point. Asher smiled again, a bit embarrassed by the compliment. He made a sound somewhere between a chuckle and a sigh, then attempted a response. Well, I know I enjoy what I do, but I guess it's for someone else to judge how good I am at it. That's how the art world works, right? Is it? Theo shifted his weight in the armchair. Asher, let me ask it this way. From your point of view, as a professional artist, what makes something good art? You should know better, Theo. Ask an artist what it takes to make good art, and you're almost sure to get an autobiography in response. Theo chuckled, and Asher continued. It's hard enough to define what art is, much less good art. I wonder if there is such a thing. Maybe they're just good responses. But I guess if a work of art makes us see something familiar in a new way, or makes us feel something we ought to have felt all along, or shows us our place in the world more clearly, maybe then it qualifies as good. If it makes us better somehow, maybe that's what gives it value. Asher paused for a sip of coffee and to gather his thoughts before he continued. Theo remained silent. That means, of course, that good art varies from one person to another, doesn't it? And the good art can come from a child or a master. I don't think the critics, especially the moderns, appreciate that idea very much. I think they like telling us what's legitimate as art and what has worth and what doesn't. Asher looked at the old man. Theo, I get the impression you've thought about this before. What do you think makes for good art? Theo rested his chin on his right thumb and placed a bent index finger over his bottom lip. Yes, I have thought about it. In fact, I've thought about it a great deal. And I've asked others about it. But I don't know if I have an answer either, other than this. It might not make a lot of sense, but for anything to be good, truly good, there must be love in it. I'm not even sure I know fully what that means, but the older I get, the more I believe it. There must be love for the gift itself, love for the subject being depicted or the story being told, and love for the audience. Whether the art is sculpture, farming, teaching, lawmaking, medicine, music, or raising a child. If love is not in it, at the very heart of it, it might be skillful, marketable, or popular, but I doubt it is truly good. Nothing is what it's supposed to be if love is not at the core. Theo snickered at himself. I think I sound like a crazy old man again. Asher shook his head. Not at all. But I do wonder, Theo. How do you know if something has love in it? Theo nodded. Yes. That is the question, isn't it? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that either. But God does. Asher looked into his coffee cup. I'll have to think about that. It's an interesting idea. One thing I do know with certainty is if good means art that makes someone famous and sells for lots of money, I'm not a very good artist. Certainly no master. Theo made no reply other than a slight nod. Don't get me wrong, Asher continued. I'm grateful for what I get to do. I'm a gainfully employed artist with a loyal clientele, good friends, and a beautiful family. You can even say I've been a successful artist. And I hope something worthwhile has come out of the studio over the years. But to answer your question, I have serious doubts about how good I am. All these unsold pieces around here would be an argument against me. Again, Theo nodded thoughtfully before speaking. Don't you think even the very great artists worked with many unsold pieces around them? Asher nodded. Fair question. And yeah, they probably did. At least until they died. A phone rang. Theo, forgive me. I meant to tell you I'm expecting a call about a commission. Would it be okay if I check to see who's calling? By all means. Asher looked at his phone. This is the call. It might take a little while. Make yourself at home and feel free to look around. You can dig through the stacks or go in the front rooms, whatever you like. I'll keep this as short as I can. Chapter 22. Asher got up and walked to one of the front rooms that served as his office. He closed the door behind him. Theo put down his coffee cup, rose from his chair, and stood hesitantly for several seconds, uncertain of which stack or corner to visit first. Street sounds, muffled in the distance, reminded him there was life outside the sanctum of the studio. But he was heedless of it all as he returned to the front hallway and began his tour of Asher's world. An array of framed items, displayed higgledy-piggledy, filled the left wall, floor to ceiling. A feather, a page torn from a book with the word dulcet circled. Small framed pieces by artists named Sotvin and Lanier. Various certificates from art organizations and civic groups, and a child stick figure with the words, "You're my best dabby in the world." Theo turned to look at the opposite wall. Only a few items hung there, all of them precisely arranged. One of those items, displayed at eye level, was an oil painting, 2 feet square, a lone tree in a field. It seemed to be more a study than a finished work. The colors and foliage in the painting indicated a spring day. A splash of crimson was on the ground. A blanket? In the field, slightly right of center, was what appeared to be an artist's easel. Behind the easel stood a barely visible figure, presumably a woman. Only the arms and legs could be seen. At the bottom of the canvas were the words, written in freehand, "Me painting you, painting." Judging from the frame and the slight yellowing in the edges of the canvas, the piece was old. That painting was surrounded by 4 handwritten letters in separate frames. They came from 4 different writers, on stationery of various sizes and tones. Each was addressed to Asher, who, judging by the dates of the letters, must have been a young boy when they were sent to him. They all acknowledged Asher's hope of being an artist someday. One was from his grandfather. The others were from artists, renowned artists, prosperous enough to have engraved stationery with letterhead, office addresses, and gallery listings. Theo knew the names on the letters. Even people unfamiliar with the art world would have known them. As he read what they had written to the young Asher, he was impressed by the warmth of their tone. Theo's own experience with artists had led him to the unflattering belief that they were often detached and impersonal, sometimes pompous and self-important. These letters were an argument to the contrary. They used words that a child could understand. They were short, the longest just a couple of paragraphs. At the bottom of one, the writer had drawn a small bird and a lightning bolt. Theo continued down the hall. A dozen, 20, 50 objects begged for his attention. He hoped that in time he might be granted an unhurried opportunity to revisit the studio and study all that was there. The drawing that captured Theo's attention, the one nearest him, was a pencil rendering of a female figure, waist up, bare except for a scarf that covered one shoulder. Her face and eyes were turned slightly upward. There was a dreaminess about her countenance. Each feature, the unbrushed hair, the half-open eyes, the prominent cheekbone, the porcelain lips and tapered chin, the curved neck, the lift of her breast and torso, the veined hands and delicate fingers, was an intricate matrix of lines, some razor-thin, some bold, all delicate, and all as sensual as the Song of Solomon. Together, the features and line strokes created a technically precise, ethereal composition. The beauty of human flesh, fearfully and wonderfully made, radiated from the frame. The drawing was done on gray Bristol board, paired perfectly with a wide ebony frame. The frame. How is it, Theo wondered, that a piece of paper, a letter, a photo, a ticket stub, a sketch, a painting, is suddenly transformed by placing it in 4 bits of wood beneath a pane of glass. What does it mean that we place permanent boundaries around transient moments? What does it say of humankind that we take such trouble to freeze specific memories, that we devote such energy to capturing and preserving the minute particulars of our lives? Theo could hear Asher's muffled voice behind the closed door of the office, but he paid it no mind. He was immersed in all that was before him. He intended to move along to see Asher's other works, but he remained at the drawing of the woman, obedient to his conviction that it was better to see one thing well than many poorly. He became conscious of a sound down the hall, a chair sliding on the floor, and could tell from the intonation of Asher's voice that the phone call was winding down. Moments later, the office door opened. "Theo, I'm sorry that took so long." "Oh, I could not have been more pleased. I feel like I'm swimming in an ocean of stories, even if I don't know what they are." He nodded at the feather, the page with the single word circled, and the others. Asher chuckled. "Well, you're right. They all do have a story, even if I'm the only one interested in them." Theo said, My guess is that many would be interested. The mind of the artist is a place of fascination to most of us, you know. All that mystique and all those visions. But maybe some of the stories are best kept in the vault of secrets, yes?" Theo knew that vault well. "Sometimes I wonder about all that talk about mystique," Asher replied. "The artistic temperament and such. I mean, I know there's such a thing, but if an artist has a family, he learns that art has to wait its turn sometimes. Housework and skin knees and soccer games do wonders to keep one's feet on the ground around here. There's not much mystique to being a member of a family." Asher chuckled. "But I do have to admit, mystique, even if it's a pretense, can be helpful for business, can't it? I think sometimes the serious art buyers aren't very interested in paintings by someone as ordinary and unmysterious as me. Maybe if I were a little more brooding, buyers would take my art more seriously." Theo grinned. In such a short time, the elderly man and the young artist were talking like old friends. They remained standing in the entrance hallway. "I don't mean to be impolite." The gentleness of Theo's voice dispelled any chance of that possibility. "But would you tell me about these?" He nodded and gestured toward the painting of the lone tree in the field and the 4 framed letters. Asher nodded. "I'll try. The letters are easy. When I was a little boy, I told my mom I wanted to be an artist. Somehow, she got the addresses of these famous guys and helped me write letters to them. I can't imagine what I said, but those 3 responded. The 4th is from her father, my granddad. He didn't give much credence to the notion of artistic temperament and could be pretty hard on my mother at times. But he was really nice in this letter to me. My hunch is that she wrote cover letters and put them in with mine. She was a great encourager. I think every obscure artist, which is most of us, needs at least one of those. Anyway, she had these letters framed for me when I graduated from art school. Feels a bit like name-dropping to have them here, but really they say more about her than about the artist who wrote them. I had the idea once that if I ever made a mark in the art world, I'd write those guys to tell them how their letters helped me. I'm not even sure they're alive anymore, and I surely haven't made a mark in the art world. Asher, I am sure they would be very pleased with what you've accomplished." "Thank you for saying so." Theo pointed to the painting. "And the tree in the field." "Yeah, that one is a bit of a mystery. It was one of Mom's favorites, but she would never tell me much about it. You see the inscription here? Me painting you painting. I don't know who the me or the you are, but it's nicely done, don't you think?" Theo nodded. "It is. Do you think she might be the girl at the easel?" "Well, funny you should say so. That's my theory, but whenever I asked her about it, she just laughed and said she'd neither admit it nor deny the allegation. Once when I asked her, she pulled her dress above her knees and said, "Do these legs look like those?" So, who knows? It was certainly like her to stand in a field painting. I just don't know the when or where or why this one. The two men stood for a matter of seconds studying the small painting. "Oh, how about another cup of coffee?" They returned to their chairs and for the next couple of hours shared a sprawling, meandering conversation in which a random word or phrase would trigger another story and another ad infinitum. Theo offered more than once to leave so that Asher could work, but the artist asserted his independence, claiming that, as his own boss, he could work whenever he wanted. "This conversation is my work today," he said. As part of that work, Asher tried to learn details of Theo's life. But just as Shep and Tony and Manette had discovered, the old man proved to be an artful dodger. It was Theo who continued to ask most of the questions, and it was the young artist who was somehow lured into giving long, revealing answers. For instance, "Asher, how did you settle on portraits as a specialty?" Asher nodded. "Well, I'd just gotten out of school. Undergrad, master's, doctorate. I had lots of education, but I didn't have any customers. Unlike Mr. Van Gogh, I was hoping to sell some of my work before I died. And, as I mentioned, I've always liked to draw people. And there used to be a little restaurant called the Magnolia, a couple miles from here, an upscale part of the city. It's where lots of well-to-do women in town used to eat lunch after their morning bridge games. My mother was friends with a young couple who owned the place. Well, that couple had twins, a boy and a girl. I had just gotten back to town, and my mom, God bless her, volunteered me to do a portrait of them. But she insisted that the owners hang the portrait in the restaurant, right behind the cash register, for at least a month before taking it home. So I did the portrait, delivered it, and helped the owners hang it properly. Even that little bit of self-promotion was uncomfortable for me, but by the time I got home, 5 calls and 5 commissions were waiting for me. I was elated. Mom was too. I suspect she had something to do with those 5 phone calls, since they all came from family friends. That's about the closest I've come to marketing myself, even after all these years. Mom's strategy worked. The calls never stopped after that. So, there you have it. The story of Asher, the portrait artist. Now, Theo, let me ask you a question. I'm doing too much of the talking. Really, why are you buying the portraits at the Chalice? I'm grateful, but I'm curious too. Do you know the people whose portraits you're buying? Theo shared the explanation, the mysterious impulse behind his purchases. He was good at telling his story by then. No, I don't know the people. I don't meet them until I give them their portraits. But before I deliver the portraits, I look at them. Don't laugh, Mr. Asher. Excuse me, Asher. But sometimes when I eat my meals at home alone, I bring a picture to the table and set it across from me. And while I eat, I study that face. Theo tapped his forehead. Maybe I'm a crazy old man. Voila. But by the time I meet them at the fountain, I feel as if I know them at least a bit. That's why I find your work so interesting. It's as if you make it possible to look not merely at the face, but through the face, to the heart of the person, to the possibility of the person. I'm certain that some of the people see themselves clearly for the first time when they look at your drawings of them. I wish you could be there when I give them their portraits. It's so wonderful. Well, Theo, that's awfully nice of you, but I have a hunch it's your words that are bringing the portraits to life. Some of them have been on the wall, speechless for months, and nobody seemed terribly moved by them. From what I can tell, you take them down and cast a spell on them, and all of a sudden, they have something to say. My niece, Manette, sure thinks so. Theo shook his head. Asher, it would please me greatly if that were the case. But I think you give me too much credit. I simply help people sit still long enough to see what is already there. He took a sip of lukewarm coffee, gathered his thoughts, and then returned Asher's question. But why? You ask me why I do it. Well, as I have said, I feel as if the idea came from elsewhere, as if it was given to me. But regardless, I'm certain now more than ever that giving the portraits is a good and loving thing to do. That is a more than adequate reason to do it. Asher, I can't do what you do, but I can make sure that what you do fulfills its purpose. I confess that at first I did it hoping to make someone else happy, and I fear that my reasons are almost entirely selfish. I do it because it brings such happiness to me. I don't know if I've ever done anything I enjoy more, and I'm just beginning. Asher nodded pensively and smiled. I'm happy it makes you happy. Which portraits have you bought so far? Just a few. But I have only been here for a short while, you know. Minette, Kenrick, Frankie, some others. I'll do another tomorrow. I'm thankful you write their names on the back of the frames. It helps me find them. So, only a few thus far, but if I have my way, and if I live long enough, I will empty the chalice. You just keep working, young man. I'll buy all the ones there now, and then any others you put in their place. At my age, what good is money in the bank? Asher said, Your kindness is not just a gift to them, you know. It means a lot to me. He paused. You know, when Shep and Addie and I came up with the idea of putting some art in the chalice, and I started the portraits, I thought they would sell quickly, like jump off the walls quickly. I priced them really low so that people could afford them. Some of the people I've drawn probably don't have money to buy their pictures, you know, like students and homeless folks. But I know a lot of the others pretty well, and they spend more on a single meal or a concert ticket than the portraits cost. If I'm honest, the project has been a little bit discouraging, and I've wondered at times if Shep just doesn't have the heart to pull the plug on it. Asher grimaced. Gosh, Theo, I'm sorry. I know I must sound like I'm whining. I usually just share my frustrations with Brooke. Seems like unmet expectations is one of the hazards of this line of work. From what I can tell, lots of artists and creatives, especially little-known artists, wrestle with it. The old man struck a sympathetic tone. No need to apologize. I think all of us wrestle with those feelings about one thing or another. Unmet expectations have a clever way of showing up at every stage of life. I appreciate your candor. Theo, have you met Basil yet? The guy who plays guitar on the sidewalk near the chalice? Theo's eyebrows arched upward. So, that's his name. I can hear him from my balcony, but I haven't met him. Basil, like the herb. Yeah, Basil Canfield. His portrait's in the chalice. Anyway, he told me one time about his life as a musician, about how disappointing and embarrassing and pointless it feels to work so hard for tip money. He's really good, if you ask me, but I know how he feels. My work is more stable and predictable than his. At least I have something tangible I can put a price tag on and sell. But the life of an artist can be pretty deflating at times. It can make you want to cut your ear off. They both laughed. Maybe you could look at it this way, Asher. If your expectations had worked out as you'd hoped, I would have been denied a great gift. I would never have had the pleasure of buying the portraits, of having meals with the subjects, of finding the people and meeting them at the Feather. I would have never had the chance to tell them something good and true about themselves. Some wonderful conversations would have been unspoken. Perhaps, when you were drawing the portraits, you were drawing them for me, even though you didn't know me yet. There is a mysterious choreography at work in our lives, yes? Talk about mystique. And now our paths have crossed, and we get to do this together. For my sake, selfish as it might seem, I'm sorry for your discouragement, but I'm very happy that the portraits did not sell before I got here. Asher smiled. When Theo finally stood to leave, the slanted light of early morning had become the vertical rays of early afternoon. His legs, a bit stiff from sitting so long, required some stretching and rubbing before he and Asher walked past the framed letters and the painting of the lone tree in the hallway. They shook hands with a firmness that indicated a desire to seal their new friendship. Each put a free hand on the other's upper arm and looked one another in the eye. Something deeper than words passed between them. Asher, I thank you so very much. And I thank you, Theo. Let's do this again sometime soon. He stepped out of the house onto the porch. Asher walked Theo down the steps, an act of respect and affection, patted him on the back, and then re-entered the house. The old man opened the gate, turned onto the sidewalk, blinked hard, and walked to the river. There was, and would be, much to ponder, much to cherish, much to lament. Chapter 23. About the name, or, more specifically, the absence of the name. Theo's last name. The short answer is that folks just gave up caring about it. Once it became clear Theo wanted to be known by his first and only his first name, most of his new acquaintances capitulated to his wish. He was a Houdini at evading personal questions and answering only those that were within certain unstated boundaries. The others he sidestepped with the finesse of a river dancer. It was the same with attempts to learn his last name. His habitual introduction, "Just call me Theo," was usually sufficient to circumvent further questions, especially for people who only encountered him once. At the bestowals, for instance. If someone did ask for a last name, he usually repeated the habitual introduction with such friendly assertiveness that people didn't ask again. They would have felt impolite doing so. When pressed, Theo responded with a rambling explanation that confused or exhausted his interrogator into submission. "I have a strange and difficult Portuguese name that is long and hard to say, so just call me Theo, and I will call you Dan, and that way you won't have to try to pronounce that hard word because we have some unusual vowels in my country, and so, Dan, what sort of work do you do? And have you lived here in Golden all your life?" And then he would be off and running. Some of the most insistent, like Tony and Shep, pushed hard to get Theo's elusive surname, but even they finally gave up trying. They hoped he might share an email address or use a credit card someday that might provide a clue as to his full identity. But Theo didn't use email or have a presence on social media that they could find. Likewise, he never used a credit card with his name on it while he was in Golden. Mr. Ponder, who handled all of Theo's business, including his mail, finances, and internet accounts, had taken steps to protect his client's anonymity. Theo had a single credit card that was in the name of PH Ltd. No clues there. So eventually, people's curiosity simply dried up. As they spent more and more time around him, they cared less and less about the second half of his name. If he didn't want to share it, for whatever reason, well, so be it. The fact that he was associated with, and even lived in the office building of Mr. James Ponder, gave him credibility and standing that he might never have earned on his own. Mr. Ponder's single statement, "Mr. Theo is a fine gentleman," was more than enough to assure most Goldenites that Theo was a man above reproach, whether he had one name, or 3, or 10. The unspoken consensus of the neighborhood was that he would be judged by his fruits, by what could be seen with their own eyes, and soon, by those standards, Demeanor, speech, generosity. Those who knew him became convinced that, whoever he was, Theo could be trusted. No last name. Aside from that quirk, they were certain he was just like them, an average, law-abiding citizen, only older and better. Or so they thought. Chapter 24. Whenever a portrait was sold and removed from the chalice, another one, from inventory kept in Shep and Addie's office, was put in its place. Within minutes, a face would be freed from storage and brought into public view. Theo greeted those newcomers enthusiastically. Each one meant another name, another story, and another thread for the living tapestry he was weaving with the bestowals. What did become obvious early on was that, at the rate of one a week, it would take almost 2 years to depopulate the chalice wall of its then-present occupants. Concluding that there was no good reason to limit himself in that way, Theo resolved to increase the frequency of his giftings. He could do at least 2, maybe 3 each week. He had the time, the desire, and the money. It was Mrs. Gidley who most felt the effects of Theo's accelerated activity. Addresses of recipients could be difficult to find, especially when Asher used nicknames on the back of the portraits. It took considerable sleuthing, for instance, to ascertain that Shard Delamore was actually Richard, or that G-Dog Salter was actually Brian. Mr. Ponder volunteered to hire additional help, but Mrs. Gidley quickly shot down the proposal. By now she was fully invested in Theo's silly idea. After stepping up the frequency of bestowals, Theo's apartment was inhabited at any given time by 3, 4, or as many as a half-dozen faces, propped up on the couch, leaning on a windowsill in the kitchen, or looking down from a bookshelf. And his calendar began to fill up with appointments. Tuesday, Bob, 7 o'clock. Thursday, Hendley, 7 o'clock. Monday, Ahmad, 7 o'clock. He spent a portion of most days at his dining room table, handwriting invitation letters for Mrs. Gidley to deliver. One bestowal presented a unique challenge. Ellen. Even though she was a regular presence on the promenade, she had no address to which a letter could be mailed. Shep told Theo what little he knew about her. She's homeless, but I think she stays at the mission sometimes. I've heard she sleeps under the bridge a lot, and who knows where else. Shep chuckled and shook his head. Asher had a devil of a time getting a photograph of her. She kept talking about the goons from Columbia, whoever they are, and he could hardly get her to sit still. He had to take a picture at one of the tables outside. She's an interesting person. You want me to try and find her for you? I would like to get a letter to her, Theo explained. Do you know if she can read? Well, she's pretty private, and I can't say I've talked to her all that much. She never actually comes inside the shop. She doesn't want to leave her bicycle alone, but somebody bought her a cup of hot chocolate one day and took it to her, and now she'll just come, stand at the window till we see her. We always take her a cup of hot chocolate. Sometimes she's on another planet. Other times she's pretty clear-headed. I've seen books on her bicycle before, and I think she reads them. If you give me the letter, I'll try to give it to her next time I see her. She passes by her pretty often. Do you know her last name? On the back of her portrait, Asher had simply written Ellen. The barista shook his head. I've never heard anyone say her full name. She's always just been Ellen to me. Shep raised his eyebrows. All she has is a first name. Kind of weird, isn't it? They both laughed. Theo left the letter with Shep. It was shorter than others he had sent and was written with the simplest of words and the shortest of sentences. Dear Ellen, Mr. Gleason, the artist, drew a very nice picture of you. I saw it in the chalice, the coffee shop near the fountain. I bought your portrait and would like you to have it. It is a gift. You do not have to pay anything for it or do anything in exchange. If you will, please meet me at the fountain this Thursday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. and I will deliver it to you. Your portrait, with all its details, are quite beautiful. I am an old man. I will be wearing a green hat. I look forward to meeting you. Sincerely, Theo. Even so simply written, the letter, Theo thought, might be too difficult or possibly intimidating for the unconventional recipient. He was pleased to learn that Shep had not only delivered the letter, but also read and explained it to her. She clearly understood it and had only asked Shep to clarify the date and time she was to be at the Fetter. Shep was cautiously optimistic that Ellen would show up, and more than a little interested in how the introduction might unfold. In anticipation of the meeting, Theo spent considerable time studying the woman's portrait. Her head tilted slightly forward and down, as if reluctant to look into the camera, as if trying not to be noticed. There was a bashfulness about her attempted smile, but clearly hers was a face that had suffered loss. It bore the road wear and troubling scars of hard-fought survival. The eyes, heavy lids above and flaccid circles below, were tired and unfocused, and even on the page seemed to be darting about. The skin on her face was furrowed, a swath of corduroy from crown to neck. Her bottom lip protruded, bulldogish, beyond her upper lip, and hinted that she might be missing teeth. Her hair, pulled back and held in place by some hidden means, was wiry and windblown, rebellious against any efforts toward grooming. A bandana hung loosely around her neck. Theo questioned the wisdom of his decision to give her a portrait. Where would she even keep such a thing? But as the time for their meeting approached, he found himself anticipating this bestowal more eagerly than any of the previous ones. He had scheduled his appointment with Ellen for 4 o'clock, assuming that ample daylight would lessen any apprehension she might feel about meeting a stranger. The afternoon was cloudy, with a chance of rain, another reason she might not show, but Theo put on his hat, grabbed his large umbrella, and walked to the rendezvous. As he approached the Fetter, a full half-hour before the designated time, he saw her. She was already sitting on the bench, her bicycle within arm's reach. If Theo had arrived 2 hours earlier, he might have witnessed her arrival at the fountain. He would have seen her riding her bicycle, barefoot, from the direction of the mission. He would have also seen her walk the bicycle to the Fetter, remove a pair of knee-length socks and red high-heel shoes from one of her several plastic bags, and sit to put them on. He would have noticed that she looked around frequently as the clock inched toward 4. The Ellen that Theo finally did see as he approached their meeting was far different from the one in the portrait. She was wearing a dress, one that she had carefully chosen from the clothing pantry at a homeless shelter. It was the color of wheat, no doubt some wealthy donor's act of charity, that buttoned at the neck and reached just below her knees. A scarf with a floral motif, bright reds and golds, was draped around her neck and across her shoulders. She was a kaleidoscope whose every movement brought a shifting pattern of color. She was also wearing thick layers of rouge and cherry-red lipstick and a peacock-blue, wide-brimmed velvet hat. It might have been elegant once upon a time and fashionable, but now it was a shapeless vaudevillian relic, a wilted halo. It appeared that some attempt might have been made to style her hair, possibly even curl it, before putting on the hat. The attempt was less than successful. When Ellen saw the green hat walking her way, she sat up straight, patted the lap of her dress with both hands, and watched with riveted eyes as Theo approached. Before he could say anything, and while he was still several steps away, Ellen held up an envelope. No man has ever sent me a handwritten letter before. It was stated as a simple declaration, maybe even an appreciation without hostility or ill will. Theo stepped forward until he was close enough to touch her. He smiled warmly and tipped his hat. Well, then, I am happy to be the first. He bowed slightly, as if addressing royalty. Ellen, it is very nice to meet you. She fidgeted and seemed to be on the verge of saying something, but then hesitated, as if she'd forgotten lines in a script. Finally she spoke. "Oh, now I remember. Do you like my hat?" Theo nodded approvingly. "It's lovely. Blue is one of my favorite colors. There are so many shades of blue. I think the artist called this one cerulean blue." "How do you know me?" Ellen asked. Theo discerned already that the ensuing conversation might well be a runaway train of non-sequiturs. He was undaunted and pleased that Ellen had shown up at all. Apparently, she had attached some importance to the meeting. "Ellen, I only know you because of your portrait. I saw it at the Chalice recently with all the others. Have you seen it before?" Instead of answering, she tapped the envelope containing Theo's letter with her index finger. She followed that gesture with a statement, pronouncing each word precisely as if to make a point. "Your portrait, with all its details, are quite beautiful. You said 'are' in your letter." She removed the single page from the envelope, unfolded it, and held it up to Theo. "Look, the subject and the verb in that sentence don't agree. If you take out the dependent clause, it should read, 'The portrait is quite beautiful.' I don't mean to be rude, but we try to use correct grammar." Theo looked at the letter, found the offensive sentence, processed Ellen's observation, and nodded in agreement. "Well, well, you are exactly right. I stand corrected. Thank you. And yes, my grammar leaves much to be desired." He looked again at the letter. "Yes, of course, the portrait is. Of course." He noted to himself that the woman had an educated mind, even if it was untethered, and he chided himself for making assumptions about her in advance. She spoke again with unfiltered abruptness. "Are you a foreigner?" "I am, but I've lived in your country for many years. My home is now up north." "Atlanta is north of here. Are you documented?" Theo nodded again, smiling and on the verge of laughter. "Yes, I am documented." Ellen nodded at the space beside her. "Well, then, do you want to sit down? I know it's hard for old people to stand up for very long." Theo chuckled, then stepped forward and sat beside Ellen, careful to leave room between them. He was about to ask her a question, hoping he might be able to steer their dialogue in a somewhat coherent direction, but he was too slow. "You look like a Jew," she said, looking him full in the face. "So, I want to ask you something. Could Jesus eat pork? He was a Jew, you know, and people down here love barbecue." Theo did not make light of the question. He looked into the fountain, pondering his reply before responding with slow, deliberate words. "That is a very interesting question. I've never thought about it. What do you think? Could the Messiah eat pork?" Her head wobbled at the ridiculousness of the question. "I think he could do anything he damn well pleased." "You know who he was, don't you?" "Oh, yes, I've read all about him, but he could change things, too. You do know he changed water into wine, don't you? So, if he wanted to, he could pick up a piece of pork and change it to fish right before it went into his mouth, or even while he was chewing it." Theo nodded in agreement and then attempted a diversionary turn. "Ellen, thank you for coming to meet me. I just moved to Golden a few weeks ago, and I don't know many people here yet, so I'm happy for the chance to make a new friend." Ellen blushed and smiled, a lazy grin under sleepy eyes. She sat up straight and patted her dress. "I've never gotten a handwritten letter before. Your penmanship is immaculate. The coffee man gave it to me." "Oh, yes, Mr. Shep. He helped me out. Since I couldn't find a mailing address, I didn't know how to deliver it." Theo winced inwardly, afraid he might have inadvertently and rudely brought her homelessness into the conversation. But she appeared unbothered and gladly explained her situation. "Well, I sort of live in different places since I'm homeless, but sometimes I stay at the mission. Are you from Israel?" Theo's laugh was audible this time. No. Actually, I grew up in Portugal, in a small town near Porto. They have Jews in Portugal? No, I mean, yes, there are Jewish people in Portugal, and some are very dear to me. But I am not Jewish myself. Well then, do you go to church building? I do. In fact, you see that low steeple over there? Theo pointed to the barely visible top of a spire a couple of blocks away. Sometimes I go to that church building on Sunday mornings. He had pointed at St. James, a landmark known for its opulent windows and ivy-colored exterior walls. That's right next to the post office, isn't it? Ellen said. I've never been inside there before. Have you read your Dora Welty? I have indeed. Theo did not make the connection until later that Mrs. Welty had written a popular story about a post office. But, Ellen, could you tell me a bit about your bicycle? She dropped her forehead again and tucked her chin into her chest, so she had to roll her eyes upward to look him in the face. She seemed somewhat offended. Mr. Theo, I hardly even know you. I'm sorry, but I can't really trust you with my personal information yet. Theo placed his hand over his heart, supplicating her. Oh, please forgive me. It was very inappropriate of me to ask a question like that. I'm so sorry. In response to Theo's apology, Ellen was not used to such deference. Her chin lifted and her eyes relaxed. It's really not that big a deal. And since you seem sort of lonely, I'll just go ahead and tell you. My bicycle is called the Noble Invention. Do you know William Saroyan? Theo frowned. I don't believe I do. Well, he's dead anyway, but you should know him. You look sort of like him, except for his big mustache. He was a writer from California. He was Armenian. Oh, yes, that William Saroyan. Theo was struck by Ellen's literacy and surmised, correctly, that books were her language, her neighborhood, her connection to reality. Well, Mr. Saroyan said, the bicycle is the noblest invention of man. And in Rescue the Pershing, that story, the little boy did not want a new bicycle. He liked the one he had. It cost him $27.50 of his own money. Well, I don't want a new bicycle either. The mission tried to give me one, some old thing made in China. No, sir, don't even think about it. I like mine, perfectly fine. Can you ride a bicycle? Or are you too old? Theo chuckled once again at her candor. Ellen, I will have you know that as a boy, I rode my bicycle many times from Pinhao to Lamego, and once all the way from Pinhao to Porto. It has been a long time, but maybe I should try again. Maybe you could teach me. Her eyes registered doubt. Well, maybe. You're pretty old, and I don't want to get sued. Ambulance chasers are everywhere these days, probably bicycle chasers, too. Theo tisked 3 times before responding. Yes, that is a problem. But I promise not to sue you if something happens. How did you get your bicycle? I found it at the promenade. It was just lying there on the sidewalk, totally neglected. There was this skinny little kitten beside it, too. I waited for an hour. I don't know whose it was, but I said, well, if I'm going to take care of your cat, I'm taking your damn bicycle, too. When the kitten got bigger, it ran away. A dog would never do that. I've had the noble invention for 10 years. Every day, for 10 years, we've been together. That's longer than a lot of marriages. Everything I own is on my bike. Travel light. Like Mother Teresa. Did you see E.T.? He rode his bike all the way to heaven. That's what I plan to do. Are you somebody important? With that, the weave and bob of their conversation continued. No single line of thought held for more than a few sentences. As soon as Theo thought they were on a similar wavelength, she would inject an altogether unrelated idea, at least from his perspective, and move into uncharted territory. But he was neither frustrated nor unsettled by this tendency. Not in the least. He accommodated, as best he could, whatever change of direction she proposed, and accepted that he would have to learn about her in bits and pieces. He did eventually get around to the portrait, which had been sitting on the bench between them as they talked. "Ellen, I don't mean to take so much of your time. Don't be sorry. I don't have anywhere to be. Well, here is the portrait that I promised you. Would you like to see it?" She nodded hesitantly, bottom lip prominently forward. Her eyes were fixed on his hands as he unwrapped the picture. Paper gone, he rested the frame on his knee so that Ellen could see her likeness. Her reaction at first was subdued, as if sizing up a strange dog to make sure it was safe. She gazed, tilted her head, and then smiled timidly, good-naturedly, satisfied the dog was nothing to be afraid of. She approved. "Do you think it's nice?" she asked. "I do think the portrait, with all its details, is lovely." Ellen straightened up once again and patted her dress. For a stretch of seconds, she sat with her hands on her knees, studying the face in the frame. Theo held it out to her, and she accepted it with the gentleness of a mother receiving a child for the first time. She continued to gaze, sometimes pulling it close to observe a detail, more than once touching the glass as if to feel skin, cheekbone, hair. "Ellen, when I first saw your portrait, I asked myself, what is this person like? And I thought, she is a most interesting person. In her eyes," she immediately focused on that part of the drawing. "In her eyes, I saw someone who is wise and tested. I think she is very strong, but very motherly too. Yes, very motherly." Ellen turned her face toward Theo, lowered her forehead again, in what was obviously her gesture of thoughtfulness, and stared into his eyes. He continued speaking, trusting that some of what he said made sense and hoping that none of it offended her. "I think that some people misunderstand her, but she is a good woman, a kind woman, a woman with a tender heart. She could be a saint, this woman. It is in her, I'm sure. This could quite possibly be a portrait of Saint Ellen of the Promenade. Do you like it?" She nodded. Then she began to speak to an unidentified you. "Well, you always said I had a crooked nose. Here's your proof, framed for all the world to see." Her shoulders shook with silent laughter. A raindrop, and then another, fell onto the frame. Ellen covered it quickly with wrapping paper, reached for her bike, and grabbed a plastic bag, of which she had in abundance. She wrapped the portrait carefully as Theo raised his umbrella over their heads. The rain stopped after a few seconds, but the clouds remained heavy and threatening. "Ellen, if you need to be somewhere, please don't let me keep you too long." "Where would I need to be? I'm homeless." She said it in good humor, and Theo, realizing she wanted to be there at least a little while longer, took a chance on real conversation. "Ellen, do you have a favorite color?" "Yes, I do. Blonde, like a little girl's hair." "Ah, yes, that is a beautiful color. Have you noticed sometimes the sunrise is blonde? And the dogwood blossoms are blonde? And the fellow who plays his guitar on the sidewalk, Mr. Basil, I think. Would you say his guitar is blonde? A blonde guitar?" His voice softened. "I know a special little girl with blonde hair. I told her once upon a time that she spread gold dust into the air every time she brushed her hair." He paused. "Yes, blonde is a beautiful color. Ellen listened as if in a spell, her face turned ever so faintly toward him. At one point she pulled a necklace from beneath the collar of her dress, unclasped it, and held it in her free hand. She was silent for a matter of seconds. There was something akin to peacefulness, at least for a moment, in her face. And then Theo asked a simple question. "Ellen, did you grow up here in Golden?" As if he had touched a lit match to a fuse, Ellen's face grew tense and agitated. The fragile peacefulness that Blonde had ushered in was suddenly and inexplicably gone. Ellen had stepped on some mental landmine that triggered an avalanche of incoherent thought. She looked over her shoulder with short, convulsive movements, as if dodging bullets, and clenched the tip of her tongue between her teeth. Her lip bent into a snarl, and her eyes blinked in spastic fits and starts as she launched into a rambling, disjointed narrative of short, incomplete sentences. Her fingers fidgeted and pulled at the fabric of her dress. Her voice took on the frightened tone of a victim recounting a crime, dry-mouthed and breathless. She never answered Theo's question, but she made reference, in no discernible order, to the war in Vietnam, a grandmother, who was a fortune-teller, a policeman, a nurse who gave her an Easter basket, Carson McCullers, the price of housing insulation, someone named William, and the goons from Columbia. Her stream of consciousness had taken only a couple of minutes, but by the time Ellen finally went silent, it felt as if the air around the fetter had been entirely depleted. Spittle had gathered at the corners of her mouth. Her tongue moved aimlessly over her lips, as if seeking a place to rest. She stared into the middle distance. An uncomfortable silence followed. Theo had no idea how to safely resume their conversation, but finally he spoke. "Ellen, my dear, I know it must be hard to talk about." "Yes, it is, actually, and if I were you, I certainly wouldn't enlist. But if you do, don't tell them your real name." More silence followed. Ellen's hands quivered, and her head made small, involuntary jerks, aftershocks, until, like a vehicle running out of fuel, she coasted slowly into stillness. The episode of sudden derangement, whatever it was, had left her winded and pale. She took a deep breath and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Theo said nothing, in hopes that her excited thoughts would dissipate if disturbed no further. Perhaps it was time to conclude their first conversation, and yet Ellen seemed in no hurry to leave. Theo wondered what he might say or do to draw her back to the present moment. Speaking barely above a whisper, he directed her attention to the portrait. "Ellen, I think the artist did an excellent job of drawing your eyes." She removed the portrait from the plastic bag and looked again at her face in the frame. The avalanche appeared to be under control. Ellen's head trembled involuntarily one last time, like a faintly disturbed bobblehead doll. She tapped the frame with her finger. "I've seen a lot through those eyes. 1,000 stories are in those eyes. Yours, too." She looked at Theo sideways. "One time, those eyes saw a little boy fall into this fountain. He had on a blue shirt, and he wanted some money, so he leaned over, but his legs were too short, and he fell in. He cried and didn't even get any money, as Mommy and Daddy were with him, and when they pulled him out, they laughed and were so sweet to him. I went in the water and got him 2 quarters, and we all laughed, except the little boy." The fog in Ellen's mind continued to lift as she told the story, and an awkward, lethargic grin lightened her countenance. Her hands rested on the portrait. "Ellen, you're a good storyteller. You know, I like to sit at places like this And think about all the people who have walked and sat and talked here. There must be lots of stories about Broadway. People everywhere seem to like fountains. Theo was thinking Paris and Rome, Central Park and Rio. Ellen looked at the ground around her feet. Mr. Theo, do you think I'm nice? Am I making a good first impression? Mrs. O.C. Van Blarkham has been helping me with that. She helped me pick out this dress. Ellen patted the blonde fabric. She felt Theo smile without even looking his way. I do, indeed. You are very nice to sit with an old man like me. He meant it. Ellen's gaze returned to the portrait. Do you think my nose is a little crooked? Be honest. I think your nose is just right. And noses that are crooked can be much more interesting than straight ones anyway. Crooked noses have stories. Kind of like crooked people, Ellen quipped. She laughed at her play on words. Theo was struck by her profundity and chuckled along with her. He searched his mind for a question that would gain entrance to hers without setting off the rock slide again. He imagined a sensitive set of scales in her psyche that could shift from tenuous sanity to utter disorder in a second. He decided to take a chance. Ellen, the story of the little boy is a happy story. Could you tell me another one? Or maybe this, could you tell me about the happiest day of your life? Chapter 25. Theo's question triggered a transformative silence, a short span during which Ellen's face relaxed and softened. Her shoulders and chest, previously slumped and tired, straightened. Her neck, likewise, lost its weary curvature and held her head aloft, able, it seemed, at least for a while, to bear the weight of her burdened mind. That raising of her head aligned her jaw, restored her lower lip to its proper place, and gave her, blue hat and all, a certain nobility of bearing. She closed her eyes, raised her face skyward, and took a long, slow breath. Theo saw none of this. His gaze was fixed on the fetter, where raindrops had begun to fall, dimpling the pool's surface. He raised the large umbrella again, and Ellen edged close to his side. Their thighs met at the middle of the bench, and they sat safe beneath the dome of the parasol. When she began to speak, it was with a voice that was soft, clear, and controlled. She had a storyteller's composure with no hint of affectation. Theo was tempted to look her way, to ensure that no doppelganger had replaced the agitated homeless woman with whom he had been speaking only moments ago. She patted her dress and began her story. The happiest day of my life was April 12th, 30 years ago this year. I was in Charleston, and it was raining. Not badly, but a steady drizzle. The rhododendrons and crocuses were in bloom, and the gardens had been prepared for Easter. All through the old town and down near the Battery, there were peace lilies and narcissus. Even though I was in a very dark place in my life, the city was beautiful and full of light. William and I were looking for a place to sleep that night, since we didn't have a home. I was extremely tired, and my feet and back hurt, so I sat on a bench to rest. I was afraid I might get picked up for vagrancy or something, but I had to rest. I'd already been to mental twice, but I couldn't stay there anymore. That's why we were in Charleston. William, he was my boyfriend, took me just like I was and helped me get out of Columbia. But we didn't have any money or food or family or jobs, and we were just trying to survive. It was 11 o'clock at night. I know because I heard the bells from the church. And then I heard a gunshot. I just knew that's what it was, and I knew it was William. He had gone to find us something to eat. I ran to where the noise came from, and there were some people who were upset and crying, but I never did hear what they were saying because I saw William on the ground. I fell onto him because it was still drizzling rain, and I didn't want him to get wet, which makes no sense because I knew he had been killed. Other people started to gather, and I was hysterical and went into labor. Ellen paused, but seemed neither anxious nor reluctant about the story she was telling. During the silence, Theo gazed into the fetter and held the umbrella, fatherly, over their heads. He did very much wonder how, if at all, her account might circle around to the happiest day of her life. I honestly don't know much about what happened next, but somehow I got taken to a hospital. There were doctors and nurses all around. I was in labor for a long time, but finally my little girl was born. I saw her when they held her up for the first time, and I cried, mostly because I was happy to see her, but also because of William. Ellen was suddenly, but only momentarily, far, far away, in Charleston, on a drizzly night in April, looking at walls and surgical lights in a hospital maternity ward. They tested my blood and said it was dirty, but it wasn't. It was only starving. I was so afraid and so tired. They took me to a room, and I slept a long time. And then, when I woke up, there was a policeman in the room. He was a nice man. He could tell I was afraid and confused and that I didn't know what was happening to me. I think maybe he had a daughter, a teenager like me. He told me to rest, and I told him I wanted to see my baby. I wanted to hold her. When I said that, he looked so sad and just kept telling me to rest for now. I could tell he knew something he wasn't telling me. I begged him to please call the doctor and the nurse so I could hold my little girl. I asked him why he was there, and I said some ugly things to him, but he kept being nice to me and promised he was only there to help me. I just wanted to see my little girl, to hold her. Willa Francesca. That's her name. Willa Francesca. The rain continued to sprinkle up and down the promenade. Pedestrians were hugging the storefronts along Broadway, seeking the protection of awnings and balconies. Theo and Ellen were safe, dry, and immovable in the sanctuary of the umbrella. She continued her story, undeterred by the rain. I found out that the hospital people had gone through my book bag and found some papers from the mental in Columbia. Stupid of me to leave them in my book bag. The goons from Columbia were coming for me, and the nice policeman had been assigned to watch me, so I couldn't escape again. I begged and begged to see my daughter. The doctors mostly didn't care. Most of the nurses, too, but the policeman cared. And one nurse. There was something different about them. I could tell they cared about me, and they knew I cared for my baby, even though I was only a messed-up kid myself. My room didn't have any windows, so I never knew what time of day it was. I tried not to fall back asleep, even though they were giving me medicine to keep me calm and knock me out again. One time, I did doze off, and when I woke up, the nurse and the policeman were in the room. They asked me to be real quiet. The nurse said, "Be real quiet so that you don't wake up the baby." And she took my tiny little girl and laid her on my chest. That was the happiest day of my life. My little child lay there and slept. Her head and her hand were right on my heart, and I thought it would break. I was so happy, and I called her by her name. "Hello, Willa." I don't know how long I held her, but the nurse and the policeman seemed nervous. They both told me what a beautiful baby girl she was. The nurse finally said, "Let me take her, and let's be very gentle and quiet so we don't wake her up. I'll bring her back later." That's what she told me, but I think the nurse lied, so I wouldn't get upset. She knew what was going to happen. I kissed Willa on the cheek. That's the last time I ever saw her. There was a long pause. I don't know how long I was in the hospital, but when I left, the good nurse cried. She and the policeman gave me an Easter basket. This was one of the gifts in the basket. Ellen held out the necklace. A locket with floral etching and frosted gold dangled from the chain. She opened it carefully. A tiny lock of hair, blonde, was nestled in the bowl of the locket like a sleeping fawn. Neither she nor Theo uttered a word. They were silenced by the sacredness of the moment. Ellen finally whispered the child's name, Willa Francesca. Then she closed the locket, clasped the necklace back in place, and rested her hands in her lap. I ended up back at the mental. They took her from me. I don't know who or how. Kidnapping by bureaucracy. And once they declare somebody like me crazy or unfit, they close the book forever. Mr. Theo, you can't imagine what it's like to know there's a child in this world who you love more than life, a child you'll never see or touch again. You'll never know how it hurts to be told you're not mother enough to take care of your own child. There's a little girl out there somewhere, my little girl, and I haven't touched her in 30 years. Her soft voice grew even softer. You will never know. More silence. I am so sorry, Ellen. So sorry. You don't need to apologize, Mr. Theo. It's not your fault. Maybe not, but maybe yes. Ellen, the older I get, the more convinced I am that every hurt the world has ever known is somehow the fault of every person who ever lived. Maybe not directly, and never entirely, but somehow I fear we own all of the world's hurts together. Ellen nodded slightly. Whether it meant agreement or mere politeness, Theo didn't know. Their eyes were fixed on the fetter, the mixture of rainfall and fountain water dancing in a filigree of silver. Street lights along Broadway had begun to glow faintly to compensate for the cloud cover. The rain finally stopped. Mr. Theo, that was the worst thing I ever had to live through, but it was the happiest day of my life. And then, without speaking, she stood, straightened her bicycle, put a portrait in a basket between the handlebars, and turned to leave. She looked back toward the bench. Mr. Theo, a little while ago, you said when you looked at my picture, I looked motherly, right? Is that really what you saw?" Theo nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Theo." She wiped the rainwater from her cheek and rode away. Chapter 26. On the following Sunday, a crisp, cloudless morning, Theo ate a small breakfast, stopped by the Chalice for a newspaper and a coffee, and then walked to St. James for the 11 o'clock gathering. A sign at the rear doorway asked for silence upon entry. As if to reinforce that request, a psalmic passage was written in elegant script: "Be still and know that I am God." Theo entered the sanctuary and took a seat as others trickled in. The architecture of the place, inside and out, was a celebration of lines and angles, of stone and wood and glass, of mundane materials used majestically in celebration of order and mystery. It was a manifesto of beauty. The designers had made 1,000 small decisions to ensure the grandeur and wholeness of the finished work. How many souls had been stilled and comforted in that hallowed space over the decades. Sitting there, Theo imagined the men who built the structure, the muscles and motives, the sweat and swearing, the tools and tempers that, taken together, had produced so remarkable an edifice. He pondered the stresses that held arches in place, those and other invisible forces that, properly understood and employed, brought grace and symmetry to such spaces. He gave thought to the history contained in and represented by this single structure, the baptisms and burials, the marriages and messages, the hearts mournful and glad and bored and worshipful that had filled the long benches over the generations. A reverent hush filled the room as the organist played a prelude to the morning service. The music was conducive to contemplation or sleep, depending on one's disposition at the moment. As the last note of the song faded, Father Lundy rose to welcome the congregants and make his opening remarks. He had just begun reading a passage of Scripture when, to the complete and utter shock of everyone present, a loud disturbance erupted at the back of the room. The sound of breaking glass, a falling vase, sounded through the high rafters. That shock was heightened when the words being spoken became audible and distinguishable. "You get your blue-blood hands off of me, you pinstriped whore of Babylon! Touch me again, and I'll ride this noble invention right over your hypocritical ass! Get out of my way!" An usher, fighting an onset of total astonishment and embarrassment, was trying to restrain a wild-eyed woman wearing a blue hat from bringing her bicycle into the sanctuary. She had forced her way through the door, bicycle in tow, and was intent on joining the congregation assembled there. Or, more precisely, intent on finding and joining Theo. Every head turned her way. A number of leaders and others moved immediately toward the disturbance and encircled the intruder. Any semblance of order or sanctity fled the room, as Ellen, not to be deterred by another act of bureaucracy, railed against her opposition. She was equal parts prophet and whirling dervish. "Your sign, outside, says visitors welcome. Well, Saint Smartass, I am a visitor, so get out of my way. You touch my property one more time and see what happens, you throne-sniffing Pharisee. Get the hell out of my way, all of you, right now." Her fist was raised and ready. St. James had never experienced, and likely never would again, such a display of righteous indignation on its premises. Some of the congregation watched or ducked down cautiously behind their pews, horror-stricken at this unexpected visit from an uninvited guest. After all, there had been killings in churches in recent years. Others, who recognized the woman from having seen her around town, were curious and even amused that an actual sinner had entered the elegant premises of James the Saint. The biblically literate among them might have expected a finger to start writing on the wall at any moment, "Mene, Mene, Theo Farson. Panicked cell phone calls, many from the sanctuary floor, were made to 911 with the expectation that, in a matter of seconds or minutes, officers would arrive, arrest the troublemaker, and restore dignity to the meeting. In the meantime, Father Lundy implored parishioners to remain seated and be calm. Few paid him any attention. The main event was clearly at the back of the sanctuary. Across the room, people gaped, craned their necks, and whispered excitedly about the scene unfolding before them. And then came a voice. "Darling, Ellen. Ellen, darling. Hello, dear. Good morning, dear." Mrs. O.C. Van Blarcom, her white hair shining like a nimbus, stepped between Ellen and the others and touched her hand. There was no sense of alarm or urgency in her voice, but her forceful presence made it abundantly clear who was now in charge. Immediately the confusion began to subside, affirmation that a gentle answer still turns away wrath. "Ellen, please come sit with me, sweetheart. We'll find a place for your bicycle. Would you like to sit with me and my family?" Ellen stood silently for a moment, still defensive against the bodies that surrounded her. It took a moment and several hard blinks, but eventually a glimmer of recognition filled her gaze. Her hands relaxed. "Hello, Miss O.C." Mrs. Van Blarcom was a matriarch of St. James, a venerated and lifelong member whose family name was impaneled in the grand window that covered most of the sanctuary's west wall. She knew well and lived devotedly the ethic of the eponymous James. Faith without works is dead. She was not merely capable of saintliness. She was saintly. Some would have argued she was a saint. While she fit in comfortably in the highbrow world of St. James, O.C. Van Blarcom was no stranger to the soup lines and homeless shelters in Golden. She and Ellen had seen each other often at such places. She understood the difference between troubled mind and troublemaker, and she recognized in Ellen all the signs of the former: a wounded soul, a lost sheep, a least of these, my brethren. The sound of sirens had grown in strength until they were just outside the building. Clearly more than one police vehicle had responded to the disturbance. Mrs. Van Blarcom instructed several of the ushers and vestry members, in a tone of voice that would not be defied, to tell the policemen to leave. Her eyes blazed with an authoritative right nowness. "Ellen, come this way, darling. My family is right here. On that row, we have room for you." Ellen shook her head. "No, ma'am. I'm looking for Mr. Theo." At that moment, he smiled and stepped forward into the small space that belonged to Ellen and Mrs. Van Blarcom. "And Mr. Theo has been looking for you," he said cheerfully. "Good morning, Ellen." Theo and Mrs. Van Blarcom knew each other only vaguely. They had met on a previous Sunday and had crossed paths occasionally since then. Standing there together with Ellen, they were the embodiment of goodness and mercy. And for the moment the room belonged not to Father Lundy, but to O.C. and Theo, surrogate shepherds of the flock. No one shaving or dressing or selecting shoes or watching television before driving to St. James earlier that morning would have guessed that a church service could be as engrossing as this one was shaping up to be. No one could have anticipated the sight of an old man guiding a garishly attired homeless woman and her bicycle down the center aisle, 8th pew from the front, and helping her find a seat at the end of the row. Ellen kickstanded the noble invention, sat, and patted her blonde dress, touched her necklace, rested her hands in her lap, smiled at Theo, and then directed her attention to the pulpit. Father Lundy began to speak. By then he had regained his composure. He knew a teachable moment when he saw one. He also knew that the congregation, if only they could see it, had just witnessed and participated in a sermon. Need he say more? His voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. "Let us be silent and pause to reflect before we have our morning prayer." The organist, in a stroke of musical eloquence, played a simple rendering of "All Things Bright and Beautiful," as a never-before, widely enlarged sense of reverence filled the room. Some still looked at Ellen. Most, the oldest first, had redirected their attention away from the spectacle of her strange appearance and had turned their gazes inward. One could almost hear the sound of stones dropping to the ground. After the morning service, it was agreed that, in the future, Theo would sit in the last row on the outside aisle so that when and if Ellen attended, which in fact she began to do regularly, her bicycle could be parked beside her. That way the noble invention would not impede movement up and down the center aisle when collection of the offering and celebration of Holy Communion took place. It was the practice at St. James to dispense the bread and the cup at the altar to all in the faith who were able to walk forward. After the first week, when Ellen insisted on wheeling her bike with her to the communion rail, Theo was able to convince her that it would be safe at the pew. He and Mrs. Osey would guard it. He also encouraged Ellen to be on time for the service. She was never late again. Chapter 27. By the time Theo made his first walk down Broadway early the next morning, the story of Sunday's drama was already in wide circulation. When Tony first heard about it, he recognized it as the stuff of local legend. He was more than his usual animated self when he saw Theo approaching the Verbivore. "Good morning, Mr. Theo. I hear the management over St. James had quite a brouhaha yesterday morning, and you were right in the middle of it. For once, I wish I'd been in the house of worship. Tell me what happened, Theo." Theo smiled. "Tony, my good fellow, it was a wonderful morning, and I do wish you would join me there sometime." It was hardly the answer that Tony had wanted. Something in Theo's expression suggested to Tony that the old man might not want to make light of anything pertaining to Ellen. "Well, maybe I will visit sometime, if you promise a morning as entertaining as yesterday must have been. Tony, it might actually be more shocking to all of us if you walked through the door." "Touché, touché." Laughter followed. Then Tony's voice and the look in his eyes turned serious. "Theo, really, tell me what happened. All I'm hearing is second and third hand." Theo's tone and expression likewise lost its humor, but not its warmth, as he told Tony both stories, the Thursday afternoon bestowal at the Fetter and the Sunday morning disruptions at St. James. In doing so, his references to Ellen were never deprecating, discourteous, or demeaning, nor were his references to the parishioners or the clergy of St. James. Theo told the story of Sunday, in fact, as if the occurrence were nothing out of the ordinary, as if he didn't quite understand what all the fuss was about. He had, after all, seen lots of Ellens in New York City. As Theo spoke, Tony listened with an occasional nod and articulation of understanding. "Uh-huh." A pursing of the lips or a raising of the brow. A time or two he said, "Really?" more as an exclamation than a question. He puffed on his cigarette. Given that Tony actually had been inside St. James more than once, usually for funerals, he could picture the scene of the disturbance frame by frame in his bookish, cinematic mind. And despite his wry wit and tendency toward irreverence, the incident came to life in his imagination more as romance than comedy. "I'm glad you were there, Phil," Tony said when Theo was finished. "That old girl's had a tough go. I don't know much about her, but I'm thinking she's had some Vietnams of her own." The thought hung in the air between them before Tony continued. "She comes by here a lot. She loves to read. She tell you that? And some of it's pretty deep stuff. She used to go to the library, but Something, or a lot of something's happened, and they took a card away from her. I guess I can see the library side of it. She can really cause a scene when she wants to. I guess you saw that for yourself yesterday." Theo nodded knowingly. Tony continued. "She scares the hell out of the children, too, and she smells pretty awful in the summertime. I think she piled up some hefty fines for overdue books, and she had some run-ins with the staff, so they put her out. Somebody told me it really upset her when they took her card away. They had to call the police to make her leave." Another short pause as Tony took a drag of his cigarette. His voice brightened as he carried on. "So, Theo, you know what we did? We gave her a library card to the Verbivore. She's the only member. She can check out 3 books at a time and keep them for a month. There've only been a couple times she didn't bring them back, but she swears they disappeared. Probably got stolen or something. Theo, if you haven't figured it out yet, the Promenade tries to keep an eye on her. She sort of belongs to all of us. You'll get good reviews for helping her yesterday. Not that you did it for that reason, of course. You know I don't buy all that heaven stuff. But I do admit what happened at St. James sounds sort of, well, you know." Theo said nothing, merely smiled. "So, Theo, tell me one more time. That usher, what did she call him? Saint Smartass?" That's what I heard, man. I wish I had been there. And what was the other one? Pinstriped Whore of Babylon. Damn, I wish I'd been there. Where did she come up with that stuff? I bet the management is going to have quite a meeting this morning. Tony took a long pull on his cigarette, careful to blow the smoke away from Theo. And with that, the mischievous spark, never far from the surface, shone in Tony's eyes again. Before leaving the Verbivore that morning, Theo asked Tony if he had any books by William Saroyan in stock. He did, a thick paperback anthology, which Theo purchased for a few dollars. Later that day, at home, Theo found and read Rescue the Perishing, the story that Ellen had referenced in their conversation at the Feder. The little boy's bicycle really did cost $27.50, and it was true that he did not want a new one. And Saroyan really did say, in another essay, that the bicycle is the noblest invention of man. His justification for that opinion? Because I say so. Chapter 28. Basil Cannonfield strummed the final chords of a familiar Paul McCartney song, removed the coins and bills from his guitar case, gently laid his old Martin in the crushed velvet, then closed the latches and called it a day. This was his workplace, a slice of sidewalk a few paces to the right of the Chalice entrance. He had chosen the spot because of its predictable foot traffic. It was there 3, 4, and sometimes 5 nights a week that he serenaded the pedestrians of Broadway. His open guitar case lay on the pavement beside him like a beggar's pleading maw. Tips welcome. On many nights from his balcony, Theo had listened, as best he could, to the street musicians' songs. Even to his trained, cultured ear, the soulful, folksy voice was a pleasant addition to the sounds of the promenade. On a typical evening, most people walked by Basil without breaking stride. They were careful to avoid eye contact with him or even to look in his direction for fear that it might create an obligation to put something in the open case. Chalice patrons sitting at the tables on the sidewalk carried on conversations as if he were nothing more than piped-in background noise. Occasionally someone actually did pay attention, or better, stopped and listened to a song or two. Singing was a total body experience for Basil Cannonfield. His shoulders rose and fell, his neck bobbed rhythmically, and his knees bent as feet tapped or shuffled vigorously in service of the songs. He was pulled like a marionette by the strings of music in his head. From time to time he smiled at a familiar pedestrian, even called them by name, and spoke or sang to them in the middle of a performance. It was hard to tell if he actually enjoyed the work, but there was no doubt he was fully engaged in it. When Basil returned home that night around 11 o'clock, he emptied his money pouch onto the kitchen table. This ritual was the agony and the ecstasy of working for tips. On good nights, when coins were many but bills were more, the term grand total had a kingliness to it. On other, more ordinary nights, Basil could only be glad that his girlfriend Katrina had a steady job. On bad nights he wondered if it might be time to return to his job as a school teacher at Macklemore Elementary. The night had been a good one. The traffic flow had been steady and strong and unusually generous. Springtime and Springsteen had a liberating effect on people's wallets. The evening harvest was mostly $1 bills with a welcome complement of 5s and 10s. But there was something else. An envelope bearing his name, elegantly handwritten. Earlier that evening, shortly after dark, Theo had left his balcony, walked downstairs to the sidewalk, and stood as covertly as possible listening to the music. In the middle of one particularly energetic song, Theo joined the scrum of pedestrians, walked past Basil, and dropped the envelope into the open guitar case. This time Theo would spare Mrs. Gidley the trouble of delivery. Basil's portrait, a young man in his 30s, tousled, shoulder-length hair, thin, scraggly beard, attempted mustache. The face was lean and angular. If congruous to the body on which it rested, he was likely on the lanky side. An impish grin brought playfulness to his countenance. All in all, his features suggested a cross of bohemian and clown, contemplative and jester. Theo had often seen performers like Basil on sidewalks and subways in Paris and New York. He knew some of them to be gloriously talented, thoughtful, and intelligent, even if unorthodox in their chosen vocation. What was sometimes dismissed as eccentricity in them was, arguably, genius. Next bestowal, Basil Cannonfield. Chapter 29. Minette had arrived at her appointment with Theo inquisitively. Kendrick had approached his meeting skeptically. Ellen's state of mind when she showed up at her bestowal would be pure conjecture, nervous, ceremonious. Basil Cannonfield was the embodiment of calmness when he strode to the fetter, as if it were entirely reasonable and predictable that a gift-giving, one-name stranger would summon him by handwritten letter to a fountainside rendezvous on a Thursday night in early May. As he approached Theo, he was smiling with the same boyish grin Asher had captured so precisely in the portrait. "Mr. Theo, I think I've seen you before. You were standing off to the side of me last weekend, 2 nights in a row." "I was indeed." Theo laughed like a child, caught in mischief. "And I enjoyed your performance. I didn't know you'd seen me." "Well, Mr. Theo, you're not my typical audience, so you sort of stood out." It was an odd start to a conversation between total strangers. The two men looked squarely at one another, at ease and unguarded. "Actually, Mr. Theo, in my line of work, it's rare for anybody to stop and listen, so when somebody does, I can't help but notice. Thank you, too, for what you put in the envelope. 20 is a big deal in this kind of work." "Well, Mr. Cannonfield, it's nice to meet you." Theo put out his hand, again as if to do a proper introduction. He nodded at the young man's guitar. "It looks like you're on your way to work." "It's Basil. BC is what some of my friends call me. Yep, it's still a bit early, but yeah, I'm on my way to work. To my office. There aren't many rewards for being a 32-year-old street musician, but it's kind of nice being my own boss. I set my hours." "Are you in a hurry?" Theo shook his head. "Not at all. I am my own boss, too. It is," he gestured to the bench, "it's my new office." They sat close together in the middle of the bench. Basil stretched his arm across the back, as if taking the old man under his wing. There was no sign of reluctance, and one might reasonably have taken them for father and son, or grandfather and grandson. Basil kicked off the conversation with the same reasonable question Minette had asked at the first bestowal. "So, Mr. Theo, I know what your letter said, but what's the deal? Why are you doing this? It's a nice thing to do, but there's got to be more to it than that." Theo gave his well-rehearsed explanation. The chalice walls, the inspiration, the objective. Basil listened without interruption, impressed by the story and charmed by the musicality of the old man's voice, a voice seasoned with an exotic accent, spoken through lips that were bent into the constant suggestion of a grin, and reinforced by eyes that seemed to glisten with their own internal light. "Basil, you have seen your portrait before, yes?" "Well, I've glanced at it. I know Asher a little bit, and he told me he was going to draw it. When they first hung it on the wall, I went in, took a look, but it felt kind of funny to stand there staring at my own face, so I didn't look at it for long. But I have looked at a lot of the others. Asher is amazing. I can't understand why he's not big time yet. I bet he'd be really happy to know you're doing this. I still don't get it myself, but it's pretty cool." A light breeze from the south stirred the oak, a leaf as bright as a canary feather, one that had somehow held on to a limb through the long winter, finally lost its hold and fell into Theo's lap. He picked it up. "Ah, a coin of gold. That's a good idea for a song, Mr. Theo." "So, Basil, you do write songs?" "I do, but I don't get to play them very often. People give tips for songs they already know. I play popular songs to pay the bills, and I write my own songs because that's what I enjoy. It's good therapy. Coins of gold. I like that. What kind of songs do you write? What category? What genre do you put them in?" "I'm not sure what to call it. I grew up listening to all kinds of music. My parents' music, my grandparents' music, blues, rock, big band, Motown, crooners, country, folk, classical, movie soundtracks. Really, I love it all. If there is such a thing as gumbo music, we just put in a little bit of everything and see what comes out, maybe that's a category. Whatever it's called, it's a lot of fun, and you sure can't go broke doing it." Basil's big grin took over his face. "How long have you been doing this sort of work?" "You want the long answer or the short one?" "The long version, please." "Okay. So, my dad was in the Army. He's retired now, but we moved a lot when I was a kid. I'm still not sure which place to call home. We were in Golden for all my high school years. I liked it here mostly because of my English teacher and my band teacher. One of them made me believe I could write words, and the other convinced me I could write music. Summer of my sophomore year, I got a job and saved my money and bought a guitar and a chord book. That's when I started learning how to play. After a couple of years, I knew a few songs and had written some, and I was starting to sing in front of people. It felt like a calling or something, but I knew, and my parents reminded me often, how hard it is to make a living as a musician. After high school, I went away to college and got an English degree so I could be a teacher. I read this essay one time about an English teacher. Whenever somebody asked him about his job, he would say he taught a course of magic. That made sense to me, still does. He taught his students that words and books are like magic. Theo thought of Ellen and the spell that words and books had cast over her mind. Anyway, I got my degree and teaching certification and came back here. My parents had been transferred to another base by then, but my oldest sister was still in Golden. She's 6 years older than me, but we were real close. Growing up military and all the moving around we did helped us to become really good friends. An army of two. That's what we called ourselves. I wrote a song about that. Basil paused, took a breath, leaned forward, and rested his elbows on his knees and gazed into the fountain. Theo was tempted to say something and wanted to ask some obvious questions, but he maintained his silence. "BC, we're waiting for you," someone shouted from the direction of the chalice. He straightened up and acknowledged the speaker with a wave of the hand, then turned to Theo. "Don't worry about them. They'll be there whether I start a minute from now or an hour. So, anyway, I taught at one of the local high schools for several years. It was a low-income school, lots of single-parent stuff. It's hard to teach kids the magic of words when they can barely read them. And I was frustrated a lot, but I lowered my expectations and stayed at it. I was starting to get the hang of it and had some small victories. But then my sister, Genevieve, was diagnosed with cancer, and her husband left her. And sickness and in health obviously didn't include caring for a wife with cancer." Basil shook his head in obvious disgust. "I quit my job to help take care of her. It was tough, but I was lucky. I had some money saved up and could be there for her. At first, she could get out, and we'd try to do things around town, day trips and stuff. Even when she was sick, she was fun to hang out with, but it was hard to watch her get weaker and weaker." Basil paused to take a breath. Theo remained silent. Eventually, it got where Genevieve couldn't do much of anything, so we stayed home, except for doctor visits and things like that. She slept a lot, and since she liked to hear me play, I wrote a bunch of soft songs to help her rest. They weren't the kind of thing I could ever perform on a sidewalk. I loved it when I could sing her to sleep. An audience of one. The best ever. Theo nodded. "Thank you for telling me the story. I'm very honored. And your sister, is she okay?" "After about a year, she died." Theo winced. "That was 4 years ago. But it seems at times like 4 hours. Her death sort of knocked me down. So much for the army of two. I didn't have the heart to teach anymore, at least not right away. I was a mess. Get this, my sister had a life insurance policy, but she didn't think to change the beneficiary when she got sick, so her husband got a lot of money. And then, while we were having her funeral, he went into her house and took a lot of stuff. It's been 4 years, but if I saw him right now, I don't know what I might do to him. I'm just glad they didn't have kids." Theo shook his head. Basil sat up straight as he continued. "So it was heartbreak and rage and just a heck of a time for me. There were some dark days. I took over my sister's lease and still live there. My girlfriend is with me now, but for a long time I was there alone. Sometimes I'd sit by my sister's bed and play songs. Probably sounds kind of morbid or crazy, but those moments were my rescue. I could still imagine I was singing her to sleep. Anyway, I'm not sure where the idea came from. Maybe it's like that urge you had about the portraits, but one day I had the thought of singing on the street. I'd seen others do it and figured I could give it a try. I knew I wasn't ready to go back into teaching. It took a while to figure out the rules of being a street performer, who can stand where and all that. But I finally got it straight, and it took me a while to get used to being ignored by people, but that comes with the territory. You gotta have thick skin to do this for a living. You ain't gonna make it long if you don't." "Ain't?" Theo took note of the southernism. "Ain't." It was his first time to hear it used. It was a word that played squarely into the sort of stereotypical caricature of the South that Theo had brought to Golden. In truth, Basil had been a serious student in college and could diagram a sentence with impressive exactitude. He was capable of the King's English, but he also knew the patois of the street and was well versed in the fine points of Southern jargon. There was, to him, something lovable and endearing even artistic about the dialect of the promenade. He felt no shame speaking and singing in the vernacular of his neighbors. And then, as if suddenly aware that he had not yet responded to Theo's question, Basil gave the short answer. 2 words. 3 years. I've been doing street music for 3 years. Do you only play on certain nights? Most weeks, spring through autumn. I play at least 3-4 days a week, especially weekends. And winter, Shep lets me play in the shop sometimes. I don't make much money, but my girlfriend and I are pretty low maintenance. I don't know how much longer I'll do this, believe it or not. It's pretty hard work. My poor dad thinks I lost my mind, and my mom worries about me starving. I should have outgrown my need for their blessing by now, but what they think still matters to me. I consider doing some tutoring or substitute teaching just to be able to tell them I have a respectable job. Theo perked up. He knew a little girl who might benefit from having a private tutor. So, you still teach sometimes? Not yet, but maybe. Do you still write songs? All the time. I don't finish many. If I had a reason to, concerts or something, I think I would, but mostly I start them and quit before I'm finished. I hope someday I can record a few of them, a good recording, just to see how they'd sound with a bit of polish. In fact, have you seen the guy who carries the cello around, Simone? I barely know him, but I told him I was going to write a song for him and his cello. That would be kind of interesting, wouldn't it? So, Mr. Theo, that's me. What about you? Your letter said you just recently moved to town. Another shout across the median, the same voice as previously, called out to Basil. He waved it off, as he'd done minutes earlier. It looks like you need to get to work, Theo said. Your fans are getting restless. Basil chuckled. If I depended on them for my next meal, I'd be in trouble. But, well, maybe I do need to go. Let's talk again sometime, okay? Basil, before you go, may I tell you something? Theo pulled the paper off the portrait and held it on his knees so that it was plainly visible to both of them. I want to tell you what I saw when I looked at your portrait. Basil said nothing, but, emboldened by the old man's focus on the drawing, looked at himself as Theo's finger touched the glass. I saw a boy in the smile. It's a face that hasn't forgotten playfulness. I think children would be drawn to this face. But I also see a man. There is wisdom here, I believe, in the eyes. A young, tender heart, a wise old soul. That's a good combination. Wisdom and playfulness. There is the possibility of a saint in this face. This could well be a portrait of Saint Basil. Basil shook his head at such a ludicrous suggestion. Saint Basil? No time soon, I'm afraid. I've already told you enough to permanently disqualify me from that club. I hate my brother-in-law. I wimped out on teaching kids in poverty. I'm living hand to mouth. My mom says I'm living in sin with my girlfriend. I'm hardly making the world a better place. They'd have to change the requirements of sainthood a lot for me to ever be one. Theo smiled and patted Basil's knee. Basil, my good fellow, there is a term for ones like us. Raw material. Read your Augustine, and remember, heaven can draw a straight line with a crooked stick. Though still doubtful, Basil grinned. I suppose so. But sainthood? I don't think so. Maybe I'll just try to be the guy you see in the picture. Wisdom and playfulness? Theo patted Basil's knee again and nodded his old head. That's a start. Tender heart, wise soul. That's a good start. Go sing like that fellow tonight. They rose to leave. What started as a handshake became the comfortable and confident hug of two old friends. Basil picked up his guitar case and backpack with his left hand and gripped the portrait, loosely covered with the wrapping paper, in his right. "Well, Theo, wish me a good night." "Yes, yes. May all your tips be 10s and 20s. Now, don't get carried away. And may all your tips tonight fall from heaven, coins of gold." "I like it." "Hey, Theo, you didn't ask me about my name. People always ask me about my name." They ask me about mine too. Let's leave it at this. You are Basil, and I am Theo." A gold leaf fell between them. Another late departure. The lanky figure took his place on the sidewalk, strummed loudly, lifted his voice, and sang. Theo remained at the fountain, listening to the sounds of street noise before heading west to watch sunset over the river and then returning to Ponder House. Chapter 30. As part of its downtown renaissance, Golden had constructed a 12-mile walkway beside the Oxbow River in faith that, if we build it, they will come. The desired gravitational pull began in very short order to draw young families, children, love-struck couples, elderly strollers, artists, photographers, tourists, troubled souls in search of calm, dog owners, and runners to the waterside thoroughfare. But even when busy, the Riverwalk, as it was known, rarely felt crowded. Anyone hoping for a place to sit quietly, and no shortage of options available to them. On his bench beneath the chestnut oak, Theo had an open view, upstream and down, from which to watch, hear, and cast his thoughts into the flow of the Oxbow. Where the current might take those thoughts on any given day was a mystery. They often returned to the river, 4,000 miles away, near his childhood home in Portugal. That river, the Douro, river of gold, traversed the wine country and was much like this one. Tree-lined, navigable, and musical. It ran through villages, through the countryside, over stone, and beneath bridges, in areas lightly populated or entirely secluded. And like every river everywhere, it hosted sunrises and sunsets of unspeakable and often unnoticed beauty. It welcomed the adventurous and the amorous, fisherfolk and philosophers, the playful and the plaintive. Decades ago, it had welcomed a little boy with a keen sense of wonder and an eye for the sublime. On the blissful days of spring and summer, when the scent of ripening grapes was in the air, a scent that would somehow be bottled and sent around the world to be enjoyed at future times and distant tables, he would answer the call of that river, blessedly free to spend hours by himself or with other young friends. Imagine a boy on a bicycle. Past the pastel-tinted storefronts and dwellings, the stuff of postcards and travel brochures, beneath the thunderous bells of the church building, through streets filled with the aromas of sardines and coffee, surrounded by a shadow of antiquity that coated ancient structures with shades of teal and ochre, and accompanied by the romantic language of the Portuguese. By that route, the boy would arrive at the footpath to the banks of the Douro. Once there, the serious work of play and exploration took over. There were local fishermen, at the riverside or in their boats, to be studied. There were birds to be watched, lapwings, kites, swamp hens, eagles, nests to be discovered, stones to be upended, and any number of extravagances beneath them to be scrutinized. Shells, crustaceans, slugs, smaller pebbles. If he were with other boys, as was often the case, there were stories to be invented, castles to be built, battles to be fought, and feats of courage to be dared and performed. And, of course, there was wading and swimming. That young boy, now grown old and resting on a bench in the American Southeast, watches the same sun that, decades ago, had tanned his strong shoulders and glistened in his ink-black hair on the hillsides of southwest Europe. And he wonders, might it be that water from the river of his childhood, had found its way to this one, that the cyclical life of rainfall, sky to earth to sky again, over and over, had brought the elixir of the Iberian wine country to this place, that the river of gold in Portugal had come through cloudburst and current to this river of gray and golden, and had some of Golden's flow found its way to the hillsides of Theo's childhood? Was there, after all, only one big river that flowed across the earth? Across the river, a thread of color, woven into the evening clouds, caught Theo's eye and conjured up a memory from boyhood. It was summer, a Saturday, clear weather. Theo left his bicycle at home and walked into the town that morning. He and his friends spent an energetic day together, kicking football, walking through the marketplace and the town center, sitting among others at the fountain, and finally exploring the riverside. By late afternoon, the small gaggle had begun to thin, falling away one at a time until Theo found himself alone, walking home by the route that allowed him to stay by the Douro for as long as possible. For a young boy like Theo, one with a sensitivity to the subtleties of light and color, the beauty of early evening was entrancing, even if he had no words yet for the feeling of sacredness that was taking up residence inside him. Perhaps there are no such words. As he walked the footpath along a treeless stretch of shoreline, he saw ahead a small fishing boat, Menino do Rio, anchored in an eddy among short reeds. It was a simple craft, outfitted with oars and an old 3-horsepower motor. It was well maintained, freshly painted, and filled with all the equipment of the trade: nets, rods and reels, line, catchwell, and bait box. The owner, like many in the region, probably worked the vineyards and the river, depending on hour of day and time of year, harvesting from land and water for his daily bread. Near the boat on the river bank stood a fisherman, whom Theo had never seen before. The man wore high rubber boots, a short-brimmed cap, and the working clothes of a commoner. His heavy shirt, rolled up at the sleeves, was stained with the evidence of a day's catch. He was stocky and muscular, a fact that became clearer as Theo walked toward the man. Heavy stubble highlighted his strong, square jawline. Thick eyebrows guarded dark, serious eyes. At first, Theo could not tell what the fisherman was doing. As he stepped closer, however, he realized that the man was painting a picture, standing at an artist's easel facing west. The man held a palette with small bowls of color in his left hand and a paintbrush in his right. His eyes were fixed intently on the sunset and the distant shore. He did not seem to notice the boy approaching hesitantly from his left. Not that young Theo was afraid or timid, not in the slightest. Rather, he sensed intuitively that the man was doing work worthy of silence and should not be disturbed. Theo stood behind the stranger, with only a few feet between them, and watched as the western horizon took shape in miniature on the canvas. With each brushstroke, the fisher-painter's sinewy arms rippled, as they did, no doubt, when he pulled at his net or fishing lines. In both cases, the man was in quest of a catch. At the moment, he was intent on catching the sky in front of him. The little boy discerned a pattern in the artist's work. Observe sky, observe canvas, brush to palette, mix color, brush to canvas, stroke or dab or blend, again and again and again. Without knowing he had done so, Theo had inched forward until he was standing close enough to touch the fisherman, close enough to smell the odd, subtle fragrance of oil paint and perch. "If you step here, I believe you can see the canvas better." The fisherman's voice startled young Theo and brought him out of his daze, but he said nothing in reply. The man continued speaking as if he and the boy were old friends who had long been in conversation. He only looked at Theo from the corner of his eye. There was a welcome in his voice. "Any fisherman knows that this is the best time to be fishing. but artists know this is the enchanted hour, when the sunlight is most magical. It's hard to know sometimes, fish or paint, right? Fish or paint. Well, I tell you, this time of year, I'm afraid I have no choice. I always make time for this. And thank the Almighty, I had a nice catch this morning. A full net. If I could, I would do this every evening for the rest of my life. I would stand right here every evening and paint that same tree line, that same horizon, that same sky, and no two paintings would ever be the same. Theo listened without reply, not fully understanding what the man was saying. He watched like one in a trance as the man painted. Observe sky, observe canvas, brush to palette, mix color, brush to canvas, stroke or dab or blend. The man, brows raised in query, looked at the boy with a disarming gentleness in his eyes. Am I getting close? Is it done? The boy remained silent. The problem with the sunset is that it won't stay still. In a single minute it can change itself entirely. See? He touched the brush to the canvas at a streak of orange that he had applied only minutes before. See? Then he pointed his brush toward the western sky. Instead of orange, there was now a muted shade of violet. It's already gone. Oh, well. The Fisher painter continued working without further comment. The canvas was almost full of color, and the act of benevolent larceny, stealing a sunset, was almost done. A small portion of the canvas, at what should have been the river's western shoreline, remained unpainted. The fisherman stepped slightly in front of the easel, knelt down, and pushed the handle of the paintbrush into the soft ground beside the water. He pushed his finger into the gray sediment and scooped out a dollop of sludge. He stood, returned to the easel, and began to rub the mud into the unpainted spot on the canvas. Use what you have. Now you. Give me your hand. Theo obeyed. The fisherman put river dirt on the boy's right thumb. Now paint. Theo stood motionless, uncertain. The fisherman, a bit more insistently but not unkindly, repeated his instruction. Paint. Here, do as I do. By way of example, he dragged his finger left to right, careful not to press too heavily into the canvas. Then he took Theo's hand and guided his muddy thumb along the painting surface. The fisherman leaned back and chuckled. Well done. You are now an artist. Theo smiled shyly. Now, boy, your dear mom is going to be worried if you don't get home soon. If she's upset with you, give her this and tell her you are painting. The fisherman took the canvas from the easel, handed it to the boy, instructed him to be mindful of the wet paint, then patted his shoulder and pushed him along. Theo walked home with the sunset in his hands. When he turned away from the river and into the streets of the town, he looked back a final time to see a small, strong figure in the distance, pulling oars against the current of nickel-plated water. For weeks after that evening, Theo returned to the river, expecting and hoping that he might meet the artist again. It was not to be, and Theo wondered if the evening and the bestowal had ever really happened. Most assuredly, it had. On the wall behind his desk in New York City, a framed canvas of western sky and Portuguese riverbank was tangible proof that fishermen paint sunsets and angels are real. Chapter 31. From his wicker throne in front of the Verbivore, Tony had a clear line of sight to the fetter. More specifically, to the bench on the south side of the fountain where Theo carried out his bestowals. Tony had seen Theo and Minette when they sat there together, and Theo and Kendrick. and Theo and Ellen, and Theo with Basil, Junior, Bun, Frankie, and others. It was obvious to Tony that the tete-a-tetes were not accidental, but he kept his questions to himself for a while. The little he knew of Theo satisfied him that whatever the old fellow was doing, it must be something useful, good, or at worst, harmless. Eventually, he did ask Theo about the fountain encounters. It was a sunny morning. The two of them were sitting alone outside the Verbivore. Tony was well into his second cigarette of the day. "Theo, explain something to me. I've got a clear view of the fountain from here, and I see you over there a lot. You're always with somebody, and you all seem to be talking about something important. So, if you don't mind me asking, what are you doing over there?" Theo nodded. "I don't mind at all. But would you keep it between the two of us?" "Sure." "Actually, Tony, you already know. I told you already about giving Ellen her portrait. Remember? Well?" Theo told Tony the story of the Epiphany and the chalice. "Giving the portraits is my life's work at this point." Even Tony, the contrarian, couldn't help but be touched by the old man's thoughtfulness. He shook his head in mild disbelief, patted Theo's knee, and strung together a litany of phrases and questions that were intended to be compliments. "Well, that beats all. I'll be damned. Who on earth thinks of something like that? That's crazy as hell. And it's awfully nice of you, but Theo, really, I mean, really, why on earth does anybody do something like that?" Theo smiled, nodded skyward, laughed. "I'm serious, Theo. Let's have a real conversation sometime. I want you to tell me why you do that. I want to know." "It would be my pleasure, Anthony. My pleasure." That hoped-for conversation did eventually occur. Sort of. "Theo, the mafia bosses like you drink brandy. I got a special bottle I'm saving for a special occasion. Let's open it tonight. I'll close the shop and lock the door so we can meet without the loafers hanging around and interrupting. 8 o'clock work?" Actually, 8 was on the late side for Theo, but he offered no alternative. 8 o'clock it is. What can I bring?" "Yourself and an empty glass." "I'll be there." "Forget the empty glass. Just bring yourself." At the appointed time, Theo walked into the Verbivore, stood at the door as Tony locked up, and navigated his way through stacks of books to the chaotic space known as Tony's office, where a pair of comfortable chairs awaited them. A small table, 2 glasses, and a bottle were within arm's reach of both chairs. A lamp on Tony's desk created an island of warm light around which books of every size, shape, color, and texture stood sentry. The space had the gravitas, if not the decor, of a confessor's booth. Tony poured brandy into the glasses. They raised them ceremoniously to each other's health, took a sip, and then settled back into their chairs. For a half hour or so, they talked about life on Broadway and the acquaintances they had in common. Ellen, Shep, Simone, the penny loafers. "I saw young Simone this afternoon," Tony said. "He told me to tell you hello and said he'd still be happy to get with you sometime and talk about cello stuff. He's a bright kid." "It takes a special mind to master that instrument," Theo replied. "I hope I get to hear him play sometime." When they finished their first glass of brandy, Tony poured another for each of them. His eyes already glowed with the effects of the first. "Theo, this is an old bottle. A friend of mine, a fellow grunt from Vietnam, gave it to me at a reunion we had when the wall was unveiled in Washington. You know the wall?" Theo nodded. 58,320 names on black granite had become an icon among American monuments. "That was a hell of a day, Theo. It's amazing how a flat piece of stone can change your life, but That damn thing brought stuff up in me I've been holding in for a long time. I'm still not sure why I went to see it. And I'm not sure I should have, but it probably did me some good. You ever fight in a war? I lived on the fringes, but never fought in one. I remember bits of the war in Spain from my childhood, and I was 13 when World War II ended. Thankfully, Portugal was on the sidelines. We remained neutral, but we felt the effects long after it was over. How long were you in the military, Tony? Too long. I was drafted. I didn't really know what the hell it meant. I don't think any of us did. If we had, we probably all would have run to Canada. If somebody had shown us a film of what Vietnam really looked like and felt like, and then asked for volunteers, Uncle Sam couldn't have fielded a baseball team. I was in for 4 years. 2 here, 2 there. Or maybe 2 there, and the rest of my life here. A lot of us brought the jungle back home with us, and we've been there every day since. It was a hell of a mess, Theo. That war messed up a lot of guys, something terrible. Tony's voice lightened, almost to cheerfulness. Theo, you might not believe this, but before Vietnam, I was a nice, quiet young man who read books and obeyed the rules. Didn't smoke, didn't drink, didn't cuss. I was a bit of a nerd. I was planning to go to college, maybe on a golf scholarship, but all that changed when they drafted me. I couldn't qualify for a deferment, and my parents didn't have any pool, so I got shipped off to basic. They shaved my head, gave me a new wardrobe, taught me a bit about being a soldier, and then sent me to Vietnam. I was what they called a quickie. The Army needed lots of young fighters over there, so they sent us whether we were ready or not. I'd never shot a gun before, and here I was going into combat, in the jungle no less. I wasn't excited about it, but it felt kind of manly for about 2 days. I was in pretty good shape from walking on American golf courses, but God Almighty, was I in for a surprise. Tony took a long pull from his snifter and let the amber fire rest on the back of his tongue. The guy who gave me this brandy lives up in Illinois. We served together in 1st Infantry. The jungle totally ruined him. He's been drunk, stoned, homeless, in jail ever since he got back. That's over 50 years. He got married a couple times, but they both fell apart. We hadn't seen each other for years until the wall dedication, and when we saw each other, it was the weirdest thing. We shook hands and laughed like it was a high school reunion. And then out of nowhere, we both started sobbing. All of a sudden, I think we both had visions of what we had lived through together. God, it was horrible. Tony closed his eyes and groaned. It was hell. It was hell. And, it was like when we saw each other, we're both thinking, did we really live through that? Were we really there? And I think we both hurt for each other. Then I grabbed him, and we held on to each other, and I swear, it felt like we were begging for forgiveness or something, not just for being soldiers in that war, but also for being part of a world that can do such god-awful things. Tony closed his eyes, squinted, and squeezed the bridge of his nose between a thumb and middle finger. He poured himself another generous portion of brandy. By slow degrees, he was being transported to a realm of thatched roofs, rice paddies, and palm trees. The rasping hum of insects and the gummy heat of the tropical forest began to fill his sodden thoughts. Muddy fatigues on bug-bitten skin, the scent of napalm, ominous stares of villagers squatting on their haunches, torn limbs and pained faces of wounded comrades. It all began to surface like smoky visions from a crystal ball. That fellow and I served at Ben Suck together. You ever heard of that? Theo shook his head. Not many folks know about it. But it was a pretty hot area, near a place called the Iron Triangle. We'd been out in the jungle on a mission for weeks, up to our asses in blood and pus and bugs. And as soon as we got back to base, they told us we had to go on a big surprise mission. The very next day, to this little village called Ben Suck. It was on the Saigon River. From the air, it was actually a pretty little place, at least until the war. There were lots of VC there, the bad guys, and it had been a thorn in our side, so the big bosses finally decided to deal with it once and for all. The mission was real hush-hush. Didn't even tell the South Vietnam Army about it until the day it happened. We just woke up that morning and dropped hell on their heads. Theo listened without moving. The plan was simple. Attack and capture or kill the bad guys. Then evacuate the women and kids and old people, and then totally demolish the place, bomb it, burn it, bulldoze it, just make it disappear. It wasn't much of a fight, really. We went in on 60 helicopters. It only took 15 minutes to land and offload every one of them. Pretty damn impressive. Most of the enemy ran when they realized what was happening, and when we landed, there were mostly just women and children in the village, lots of them. We were still on high alert because there had tunnels all over the place. But we didn't have to do much shooting. Tony swigged his brandy. I even made a friend, sort of, with this little kid on the first day we were there. Kids are amazing. At first, whenever we went into a village, even if we blew the place to hell, after a while the little kids would come out and they'd start looking for things to play with. Empty shell casings, plastic pipe, tops, anything. We were their toy store. Can you imagine? Well, this one little kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old, was at a hut while his mother was packing her stuff to evacuate. We were going to airlift all of them out over the next few days and relocate them. Well, I'm walking by, and this little boy looks at me, and I saw a smile, which was not really like me, especially over there, but damn if he doesn't smile back. And a little while later, I notice he's following me around. And the whole time, I could hear bombing and shooting in the distance and sometimes close by, and it was a pretty chaotic situation. And this little kid just keeps following me around. I wasn't paying him much attention. I was too damn busy, but I kept an eye on him. Even kids could hurt you over there, and we were always on edge around him, but all he had on was a little raggedy-ass pair of shorts and no shirt. So I could see there weren't any bombs or weapons strapped to him. Another swig. Late that first day, the little kid brought me an egg, like a sign of friendship or something, just a plain old chicken egg. But that was kind of a big deal. I wanted to give him something, but I didn't have any candy, and I couldn't give him a knife or anything like that, so Theo, get this. I gave him my good luck charm. It was all I had. Theo asked the obvious. What was your good luck charm? Don't laugh. It was a golf ball. When I was in high school, I was on the golf team, and one day practice, I hit a hole-in-one. Hole number 12, Golden Country Club. Big deal, right? But I kept that ball with me all the time. I got teased about it a lot. Go to the prom with a golf ball in your tuxedo pocket, and you're setting yourself up to get ragged on. Like I said, I was a bit of a weird kid. But I had that same golf ball with me in Vietnam, in the pocket of my fatigues. And I thought, well, if anybody needs some good luck over here, it's probably that little kid. So I gave him the golf ball. You'd have thought I just gave him the Hope Diamond. I didn't see him any more that day. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of villages that had to be evacuated, and there were people and farm animals and troops all mixed in together. It was dangerous as hell, and we knew there were still VCs in the area. It took 3 days to complete the evacuation. We were exhausted, and we'd given the enemy plenty of time to organize an attack if they wanted to come after us. We're all on edge, mad and jittery. That's a dangerous combination. Tony paused, massaged his forehead, rubbed his eyes with a thumb and middle finger again, took a gulp of brandy, and trained his eyes on the air in front of him. I'm talking too much. Theo sat in priestly stillness, struggling for something to say. Before he could conjure up anything, Tony resumed his story. His words had become hesitant and sloppy. There were long, dense pauses as his memory imported every emotion he had felt in the jungle near Ben Suc that day. Exhaustion, terror, hatred, a tense anticipation bordering on nausea. He was in a world far removed from Golden. The calm stillness of the Verbapore was a figment. Vietnam was his reality. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, took a deep breath, exhaled slowly through distended cheeks, then straightened his spine and sat back in his chair. He gazed into his glass, eyes tightening and then opening widely, as if dragons were swimming in the brandy. He was looking through the core of the earth to a rice paddy 9,000 miles and 5 decades away. Abruptly, he gasped like a man seeing a ghost. "Oh, my God, no, stop!" His hand, trembling slightly, squeezed the glass of brandy. Theo feared it might crack under the pressure. The final scene from Ben Suc had begun to unfold in Tony's mind. It was a scene from which he had fled all his adult life. He never knew when or how the play button would be triggered. Sometimes it was a nightmare, sometimes a photograph or a line in something he read. The vision had struck on one occasion in a grocery store, when his cart had nearly bumped into a child in the bakery aisle. Now, with brandy dilating his veins and narrowing his thoughts, he heard the faint flutter of that awful film spooling through his mind. He shivered and took another hard pull from his glass, hoping to drown the vision. It had the opposite effect. Tony resumed speaking. He never looked toward Theo. The next day, we were getting ready to load up the civilians and fly them away. Some of the women were bitching at us, and we were trying to help them carry the pots and their shovels and their stinking pigs, and trying to stay alert in case some gook showed up out of nowhere to throw a grenade at us. We got the last of the villagers lined up to leave. There were 200 or 300 of them. There were 2 lines of them, about 20 yards apart, and a few of us walking between them. And it was still tense as hell, and we were exhausted. As soon as we got everybody out, we were going to burn the place to the ground and return to base. Tony closed his eyes, pictured the lines of evacuees, and recalled the reciprocal bitterness of those moments, from soldiers to villagers, and from villagers to soldiers, as they trudged to the helicopters. The sweat stung his eyes, blurred his vision. The weight of his gun and the weariness of recent days pulled his shoulders downward. 40 paces in front of him, a fellow GI also walked between the lines. 40 paces behind him, the same. Tony heard a shout from the rear, a shout of panic. Villagers immediately crouched or fell to the ground, covering their heads. "Tony, look out, look out, look out!" Tony heard his name again, this time from in front of him. "Get down! Tony, behind you!" A woman screamed, a shrill, cat-like shriek of hysteria. The soldier behind Tony tried to train his gun on her. Tony turned, Sweat burned his eyes, but he saw a figure running at him. "Tony! Grenade! Shoot! Tony, shoot!" Tony instinctively raised his gun and pulled the trigger. The assailant was feet away from him. The shrill cry of the woman filled the air with insanity. The air sprayed crimson as bullets tore at the attacker's chest and throat. Their eyes met. The small, shirtless body of a child splayed under the ground. "Oh, my God! Oh, my God! No! Oh, my God!" A golf ball rolled from the little boy's hand. Tony shook his head over and over, closed his eyes, took several deep breaths, moaned, took another sip, sat back again, spent. An uneasy silence followed. It might have been seconds or minutes before Tony, damp-eyed and in little more than a whisper, slurred an apology. I'm sorry, Theo. Oh, I'm so sorry." Long exhale. "I try not to let my mind ever go back there. I never talk about this to anyone." Theo nodded, but said nothing. Tony took yet another long pull of brandy. Theo took a discreet sip. He had not been drunk since the day of his daughter's death, and he saw no reason to cross that line tonight. Tony continued, his voice calmer, but his words still fragmented. "Theo, if nothing else, the war made me honest. Opened my eyes. It cured me of any romantic notions I had about the human race. Creatures who are capable of doing the things that happen there don't have much to brag about. It's crazy what a jungle and fear and a gun and some misguided patriotism can bring out of a man. I'm afraid there's a killer inside every one of us. Before Vietnam, I was just Dan and Mitzi's boy. And then all of a sudden, at least off and on while I was over there, I was a devil. Vietnam was a world full of monsters, and I was one of them. It scares me that the monster might still be in me somewhere." He paused. "As bad as the guilt and shame and nightmares have been, in some way they give me hope that I still have a conscience and a heart, even if they're screwed all the hell up. I hope so. I hate the politicians who sent us there. If there's such a thing as righteous anger, sane hate, it's for people like that. I hated what they did then, hate what they do now sometimes. But I don't blame them for what the war showed me about myself." Another pull from the glass, and then a long silence, a cooling down period. As if to declare Vietnam over and done for this evening, Tony asked a question. "Theo, you know what Ellen checked out the other day? 2 books, Peter Pan and The Killing of Pablo Escobar. She is a piece of work, isn't she?" Theo raised his glass. "Here's to Tony, who made it home from the jungle so he could care for St. Ellen of the Promenade." Tony consented to the faint praise and raised his glass. They both took a sip. "Have you always liked books?" Theo asked the question in hopes of further dispelling the intensity of the previous hour. Tony seemed all too happy to take the bait. "Well, books are safe, aren't they? Most of the time, anyway. But yeah, I've loved reading most of my life. My parents did too. They always had lots of things lying around that even a kid could enjoy. I think they did that on purpose." The two men talked books, shared something of their education and upbringing, and told some safe family stories. Tony spoke with surprising clarity for a man who had just consumed almost an entire bottle of brandy and who, only minutes before, had been so emotionally unhinged. He and Theo even laughed a time or two and enjoyed, all in all, what Tony would later describe to the penny loafers as a damn good conversation. You all should try it sometime. But the war never quite left the room. It hung like a fog around them, unmentioned any further but clearly present. Muted street noise leaked in from the sidewalk, evidence that nightlife on the promenade was well underway. For some out there, the night was still young. For Theo, it had exceeded one day's energy. He reached across the small table and patted Tony's arm. "Tony, I am very grateful to know you. Thank you for sharing some of your story with me. I hope I didn't ask too much." Tony nodded. "I don't think you asked anything at all. I'm afraid I totally lost control. I thought we were going to talk about those secret meetings you've been having at the Feather. And I was going to ask you to talk about heaven, right?" "Oh, yes. Maybe next time?" "Well, I guess if you talk about heaven, you're going to talk about hell, too." Theo raised a brow. "I have a feeling you might be able to teach me something about that yourself. I think you've had a big taste of hell already. I fear you believe that's all there is. You seem much less convinced about the other possibility." Another short, thoughtful silence descended. "You need some help getting home?" Tony asked. "Those 3 flights of stairs might be tricky." It was a dubious offer from a man who was probably incapable of walking a straight line himself. "It's okay, Tony. If I can get out of this chair, I think I can waddle home by myself. If I can't, I'll sleep on a bench by the fountain. Thank you for letting me join you tonight. Next time, we'll meet at my place, and I'll introduce you to a wonderful bottle of port from my hometown." They said their farewells as Tony unlocked the door to the shop. Theo stepped out into the night and walked home to the sound of Basil's music. Tony stepped back inside the Verbivore, noticed a bit of brandy in Theo's glass, drained it dry, and turned off the light. Chapter 32. By the time Lamisha was released from Crossway Medical Center, a month after her 8th birthday, Theo had become a regular and welcome visitor to room 626. The little girl would still have to endure future surgeries and physical therapy, but Dr. Ikande thought it best to keep her hospital stays as short as possible. It was his informed medical opinion that there is healing power in being at home. On the day Lamisha was discharged from the hospital, she asked Theo a question that had been on her mind for days. "When I get out of the hospital, will you still come see me?" His response was immediate. "It would be an honor, my dear." And so once a week, Theo would walk to the nearest bus stop, the one Kendrick used, step aboard the number 37 bus, driven by Mr. Gilliard, and make the 20-minute ride to Tilley Street, where the Whitakers lived. He would disembark at the corner and walk a block or so to their front door. They lived in a modest rental in an old, blighted part of the city, far from any hint of Renaissance. Peeling paint, missing shingles, cracked window panes, and miscellaneous other signs of neglect were standard features on many of the houses along the street. The Whitaker residence included some of those imperfections. Their landlord clearly did not spend money on landscaping and curb appeal. On the inside, however, the house was clean, orderly, and fragrant with a scent of pine oil. The furniture was mismatched, dated, and worn, but every piece was polished, dusted, and tidy. Grandmother Whitaker would have it no other way. She did the best she could with what she had. Theo tried to visit once a week, and did so with rare exception. The early visits had an awkwardness to them. The Whitakers were not used to having guests, especially ones like Theo, in their home. But by his third appearance, a routine had been established, and any sense of unease was gone. Once there, Theo would visit briefly with Kendrick and Grandmother Whitaker, and then give his undivided attention to the little girl. She was clearly the main event in his mind. When the two of them had first met at the hospital, Lamicia's shyness quickly gave way to a soft-spoken but free-flowing stream of youthful consciousness, a reward for the tenderness with which the grandfatherly old man engaged the child. Throughout his life, business dealings had brought Theo into the company of educated, cosmopolitan, refined adults on a regular basis. He was comfortable and capable, even impressive among them. But he was equally, and maybe more so, at ease in the company of children, especially a child like Lamicia. She had not yet learned the skills of pretentiousness and manipulation, and she still maintained enough of her innocence to be called a little girl. It might be wondered how an old, childless man cultivated such a rapport, such a comfortable disposition, such a disarming presence with children like her. His explanation was always the same. Two things. I had a very good father, and I used to be a child myself. And also, though he rarely said so, I used to have a child myself. Theo arrived at Lamicia's each week with a book in hand, acting on the premise that all people, young and old, love stories. He had been pleasantly surprised to find a sizable collection of children's books at the Verbivore, and even more surprised to learn that Tony was a big fan of the genre. When Tony figured out what Theo was doing with the books, reading and giving them to the little girl, he began to lay aside his own favorites, and even to ask young mothers and fathers for recommendations. Who would have guessed that the crusty old war veteran was as conversant about Narnia and Terabithia as he was about Tet and Saigon, or that Aesop and Seuss had firmly established places on his personal list of must-read literature. The penny loafers knew not to make fun of Tony's affinity for children's books. Picture the scene. Theo and Lamicia take their places side by side and close together at one end of the sofa, what the elderly Mrs. Whitaker called the Davenport. They hold their book of the week in such a way that both can read the text and see whatever illustrations are on the pages. And then, with a mild bit of fanfare, Theo delicately turns to page 1 and introduces the story thusly. Ladies and gentlemen, I now present to you, for your listening and viewing pleasure, a reading of... And so he begins. At some passages he lingers and lowers his voice for effect. At others, if the action of the story calls for it, he speaks as fast as his mouth allows. Sometimes he and Lamicia take turns reading the lines. Theo obviously has an agenda in mind when they do so. He is helping a child improve her reading skills, but he's also teaching a course, as Basil might say, in magic. The magic of story, the wonder of words, the fertility of imagination. Oh, Lamicia, you read so beautifully, my dear. Do that page one more time for me. And now, once more. What is this big word? Accidentally. And tell me, how many syllables are in the word? He claps out the syllables. Accidentally. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And how many vowels? And consonants? Excellent. You read it so well. Once again, please. Sometimes they read in unison, Theo suggesting inflection and cadence. They celebrate exclamation points enthusiastically, with increased decibels and animated gestures. The little girl savors the warmth and expressiveness of the old man's voice. It is not merely a sound, it is a place, a color, a haven. And for the old man, the moments are equally enchanted. They bring to mind vivid memories of sitting on a sofa in France, decades earlier, with his own dear child, Tita. They enjoyed some of the same books he now shares with Lamicia. Some of Theo's happiest moments long ago were story time with that little girl. Some of his happiest moments now are story time with this little girl. To read with either was to drink from a chalice of gold. Before long, Lemicia's dad, initially at her request but eventually on his own, began reading and rereading stories with her. Sometimes he required the little girl's help, and sometimes she asked, "How many syllables are in that word?" The Davenport became a home to Eeyore and Aslan and Miss Rumphius and Punchinello and a giving tree. In many of those characters, Kendrick was sure he saw glimpses of Mr. Theo. On one memorable occasion, Theo arrived with a sketchbook in hand. It contained a story of his own making, painstakingly written in block letters and illustrated with simple pictures that a 6-year-old could have drawn: stick figures, lollipop trees, clover-leaf clouds. He had written the story with a specific child in mind: a little girl with a pronounced limp and a brace on her leg, a little girl afraid of returning to school after almost a year of absence, a little girl self-conscious and fearful of being different than her peers. The story was called The Princess of Titalamish. Theo insisted that Lemicia learn to pronounce the name correctly. Like this, one syllable at a time. Titalamish. You say it. Ah, yes, wonderful. And now, once more. The word felt exotic and full of romance as it rolled off her tongue. Titalamish. The story was about a little girl who was given a pair of strikingly colorful magic shoes, a gift from Papa. Theo described them with gusto. These magical shoes were blue, 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 bluer than blue, blue as the morpho. Yes, blue as the morpho butterfly. Beautiful blue. He would go on to explain, however, that, though beautiful, the shoes made the little girl different, undeniably so, than all her classmates. Because, you see, they all wore red shoes. Red, 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 everywhere red. And because the little girl was not like all the rest of the children, they teased her and called her names and would not sit with her or be her friend. Oh, my goodness, what was the dear little child to do? Theo employed every dramatic skill he possessed: gesture, inflection, phrasing, silence, repetition, to bring the story to life for Lemicia. And in response she listened, spellbound, all the way from Once Upon a Time to Happily Ever After. When he finished the reading, Theo closed the sketchbook and handed it to his young companion. For you, my dear, this is the only copy in all the world. That gift would forever be one of Lemicia's most prized possessions. She kept it beneath another of her most prized possessions, her dad's portrait, on the end table beside her bed. Throughout his year in Golden, Theo visited the little girl. She returned to school, but remained in physical therapy and made regular visits to Dr. Ikonde. Whenever treatment or prosthetics were required, Theo made certain she was provided for as if she were his own, sometimes in open and obvious ways, and sometimes quietly through the agency of Mr. Ponder. Early on, in his weekly rides on bus number 37, Theo looked a bit out of place, but in time, other passengers who rode the bus daily became accustomed to his presence. Before long, he knew a number of them, and they knew him by name. Chapter 33. The grape harvest at Quinta das Carvalhas was abundant in 1942. 10-year-old Theo, no stranger to the hard work of the vineyard, was tanned and muscular from long days spent in the Portuguese sun. In addition to the modest pay he earned, the little boy had been promised by his father that, when the harvest was completed, they would take a 5-day trip to Lisbon. It would be Theo's first ever visit to the big city by the sea. His world previous to that had been confined to Pinhão and nearby villages on the Douro. Childhood in those places had born in him a love for nature and a preference for quiet that would remain with him the rest of his life. But the trip to Lisbon changed Theo forever. It was late October when the party of four, Theo, his parents, and his grandmother, boarded the train in Porto and made the journey south. For 5 days, the inquisitive mind of the young boy was on full intake mode. He was awed by the architecture at the monastery at St. Jerome, by the stonework at St. George's Castle in the Alfama, by the triumphal arch at the yard of the royal palace, and by 100 other sights that he observed in a rush. But when he entered the National Museum of Ancient Art, his gait slowed to a crawl as he walked through the halls of splendor. Canvas after canvas, tapestry after tapestry, sculpture after sculpture. It was too much to take in. And how, he wondered, does anyone make objects and images of such intricate beauty? Theo's parents and grandmother, intrigued more by Theo's fascination with the artwork than the art itself, did not rush the boy. They knew his thoughtful disposition and respected his propensity to ponder. They could not feel what he felt, but they knew he was under a spell as he moved slowly from room to room. At one point in that crawl, sounds of music drew Theo and his family to a large resident hall. There, a string quartet, cello, viola, 2 violins, played what, to Theo, seemed the song of angels. He stood motionless for a song that had no name, no human author, no category. Music students might have recognized it as Bach's Art of Fugue. When the performance was over, Theo's eyes stung and his ruddy cheeks were wet. He returned to Pignao after those 5 days with ears full of Bach and a mind full of art. He had seen the wider world and knew there was much about it that had moved his soul. His life thereafter was clearly delineated into Theo before Lisbon and Theo after Lisbon. Back at home, there was little he could do to fan the spark that had awakened within him. There were no libraries, no televisions, no radio, no phonographs, and no orchestra nearby. Nonetheless, the spark never died, and when he finally left his boyhood home, he made up for lost time. Wherever he lived as an adult, he became a patron of the symphony, with a more than casual interest in the music he admired. The lives of composers, the historical contexts in which they wrote, the structure of their composition, the instruments that made the sounds, and the conductors who brought the sounds to life. Theo wanted to know it all. For him, a concert was simply the final step in a long progression that included seed and forest, logger and craftsman, ink and paper, player and audience, mind and body, heart and soul, heaven and earth. Music was a microcosm. It was portraiture in sound. No surprise, then, that while Theo was in Golden, a friendship between him and Simone sprang up from their common fondness for the cello. During the school term, the young cellist was a regular face among promenade pedestrians. Once you learned Simone's routine, you could almost set your watch by his morning stroll to class. On Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays during the semester, he would strap his cello on his back, leave his apartment, descend a flight of stairs, exit onto the sidewalk, and begin walking 3 blocks south to the music school, listing slightly forward, as if fighting a headwind under the load he carried. He took careful, deliberate steps, staying as close to the storefronts as possible to avoid unintentional collisions with other pedestrians. His head was full of music as he walked. He had the almond-shaped eyes, broad nose, and dimpled cheeks of his Samoan mother. The full head of dark, tightly curled hair, the coffee-brown skin, and the lean physique were traits of his Congolese father. He was friendly and conversational, if need be, and unafraid to meet the eyes of a stranger. But he was otherwise on the quiet, introverted side of the personality spectrum. Each morning he made a stop at the Chalice, where Shep or one of the other baristas, in anticipation of his arrival, stood ready to prepare a breve latte with a garnish of nutmeg. Simone would navigate through the door, still fighting headwind, and take cautious steps to the counter at the back of the shop, mindful that an abrupt turn left or right might strike a chair, a table, or worse, a skull. He would pay for his drink, student discount, and then slowly pivot to retrace his steps toward the exit and out to the sidewalk. By 8:15, he would be sitting in the rehearsal studio, cello in place, when an equally punctual Professor Gabelli would enter the room for their 1-hour, one-student class. Simone had already completed an undergraduate degree at the State University in Washington by the time he came to Golden. He had chosen the U of G for further studies largely because of the venerable and celebrated professor, and also because he was given a full scholarship with a stipend to do so. He was a serious student, with less concern for nightlife and city sizzle than for the purity of his craft. Schools in Chicago, San Francisco, and Baltimore had all courted him for their graduate programs, but only Golden had the renowned Gabelli. Simone's parents and family lamented his choice of school, given the distance it placed between him and them, but they understood his decision and were confident it was simply another step toward his eventual renown as a master cellist. Peering into the rehearsal room on a typical day, one might see Simone's strong hands dancing up and down the cello's neck, his slender fingers sprinting from one note to another in obedience to whatever score was in front of him at the moment. The good professor would listen, nod, compliment, and correct. He gave instruction with confidence that it would be accepted and acted upon. After class, or whenever Simone returned home at day's end, he walked a bit more leisurely than he did in the mornings. It was on one such stroll, early in his first semester at U of G, that he met Tony the bookseller, a meeting that, like so many in the South, began with a moment of eye contact and a nod of the head. A simple question was the pull that parted the curtains. "You a student?" "Yep." "Well, then, let me guess. Either you're in the music school or you're studying to be an astronaut, and that's your spaceship on your back." Simone smiled broadly, dimples on full display. He was used to jokes about the cello. In short order, Tony and Simone's acquaintance grew into a friendship of sorts, nourished by frequent repartee and the occasional long conversation. Tony was pleased that the young student was able to survive, maybe even enjoy, his humor. It was one of the things Simone mentioned most often in emails to his family. "Mom and Dad, I met a local guy who owns a bookstore near my apartment. His name is Tony. He's gruff but friendly, like Uncle Spo. He likes to tease me about being a classical musician. He asked me this morning if a cello is like a big ukulele. He called it a nuclear uke, and then a nuke-uke, and then a uke on Viagra. His store is called The Verbivore. When I asked him where the name came from, he recited a poem he'd written. Herbivores eat Brussels sprouts, carnivores eat birds, cashivores eat dollar bills, and verbivores eat words. He likes to joke and play dumb, but I think he's actually pretty bright." Theo and Simone finally made an appointment to meet at the Chalice and talk music. It was a mid-afternoon when the shop was quiet. After they each explained how they ended up in Golden, Theo asked Simone to tell him about his cello. Simone was as happy to answer as Mr. Ponder had been when asked about the history of Ponder House. "When I first started playing cello in high school, my music teacher found one that I was able to borrow for band class. I played it for 3 years, all through school. The neck was bent a little bit, so it was hard to keep in tune, and there was a crack along one of the seams at the top and side. But I didn't mind. I was still able to learn scales and fingering and basic technique on it. My parents couldn't afford to buy one for me, so I worked and saved some money to buy one myself. When I graduated from high school, I found one for $1,200. That one had some flaws too, but it was a definite improvement. When I auditioned at university for the orchestra, the professors all suggested I get a better instrument. I wanted to, but I just couldn't afford it. So I kept using the one I had. When I had recitals or concerts, my professor would let me practice and perform with one of hers. I kept saving my money, but I knew it would be a while before I could buy a really good one. They're pretty expensive, you know. Theo nodded. He knew very well. In my senior year at university, my grandmother died. My mother's mother. She lived with us when I was growing up. I was really close to her. Most people thought I was crazy to study cello, but not her. She loved to hear me play. Even when I was just beginning, her ears were very kind. When she died, she left me some money. I didn't think she had a thing in the world, but she had saved some money somehow. She left it all to me with a note that said, "Buy a cello and play for the angels." It was almost $14,000. I couldn't believe it. I took the little bit I'd saved and put it all together and started looking for the cello of my dreams. It took a year, but I finally found it, or it found me. My professor told me about it. There was a man who got Parkinson's and couldn't play it anymore, so he asked my professor if she knew anybody who would appreciate and take good care of it. Lucky me. The man could have charged me 3 times what I paid for it. So, Mr. Theo, I play an 1859 Kreiner from Munich. To me, it is a masterpiece. It is a masterpiece, Theo agreed. So, let me guess. The top is made of spruce, and the sides, back, and neck are made of maple. The headstock is scrolled similar to a Stradivarius, and is also made of maple. At low C, it makes the floor shiver. Simone grinned proudly. All true. I'm impressed. How do you know so much about cellos? Do you play? I wish I could, but I leave that to artists like you. I have no talent for music, except to listen. But what one loves, one learns about. I am not sure why I love the cello so much, but I do. I once heard Casals play in Paris. I think I was never the same after that. Really? You heard Casals? The Pablo Casals? Theo nodded. It was remarkable, indescribable. I first heard his recordings of the Bach Suite when I was in high school, Simone said. That's what made me want to learn cello. Theo smiled. And your bow? What type of bow do you use? Well, I hope someday to own an Emil Werner, but for now I play with a DZ Strand, number 805, Ebony Frog, Quad A Mongolian Horsehair, 28.3 inches long, 78 grams, Pirastro medium rosin. Theo beamed. Excellent. If I'm not mistaken, that one is made of Brazil wood, yes? Simone nodded. Correct. Theo said, which means that, since it comes from Brazil, it sings in Portuguese. It took a moment for Simone to understand Theo's humor. I hope I will get to hear you and your cello perform someday. And that would be nice. When I first heard Professor Gabelli play it, I almost cried. I heard music and tones that I never knew were there. My grandmother would have been so happy to hear it. You know, my cello is sort of like a son or a daughter to me. That's why I carry it with me everywhere. I don't leave it at the school. This hockey player, as Tony calls it, is my grandmother's voice to me. And you have honor to request? Do you play for the angels? I try. And when is the next time you will play for humans? Simone told Theo of upcoming events, a quartet performance, a wedding, a concert of the University Chamber Orchestra. He was also beginning to prepare for his recital the following spring. That recital would be Simone's last step before completion of his master's degree. It might also lead to the next step on his career path, Representatives from symphonies around the country, at the invitation of Professor Gabelli, would be in attendance that night to assess Simone's proficiency. His focus and diligence, therefore, even